Hello, everyone, and welcome to our horse list for the Heavy Hitters metagame and the National Season and Pro Tour. I'm Zach,
I'm David. Buckle up. It's going to be exciting.
and today we're going to go over our format for choosing a deck leading up to one of these tournaments. So I think we have a very interesting format that takes into account a number of different factors, and it helps you choose the best deck for you based on a, a few different
Okay,
criteria.
all right. But before we get into that, Zach, who are you and why the hell should anyone care what you think?
Okay, so I'm Zach. I play Flesh and Blood. I've been playing for about 2 years. I play locally in the Virginia area. I've got a lot of really, really good players in my local area, and I really enjoy card games. I am now a full-time Flesh and Blood player. That's what I do. Well, sorry, that's my only game. I still have a job. I still work, but that's my only game. And I'm a relatively competitive player. So I've been to the Pro Tour. I've been to nationals. I'm not going to tell you that I have an amazing win rate or that I have these accolades. I don't. But I'm a very competitive player. I really love the game, and I think we've got a really neat approach.
I am a much more casual player who's heard a lot about the game and has sat in on some of the more competitive discussions. I will be here as an interviewer and facilitator. Um, so this tier list is going to be a little different from many other tier lists. We're not going to go with the kind of classic S, A, B, C, and so on. Um, we think competitive card games are very interesting, and tournaments for them, there's a lot of different factors to consider, and we've come up with this new way of grouping things. So we have our own 5 categories. We're going to start from the top. We have Pegasi, white horses, dark horses, regular horses, and donkeys. So this is going to be a very equine tier list. Zach, can you tell us a little bit about our those racing ahead of the pack, the Pegasi?
Sure. So the Pegasi are clear meta kings or meta terrors. They're the best deck in the format, and everybody knows it. They fly above the crowd, but that means that they're targets. So everybody's got a bow and arrow, a crossbow to try and shoot them down. Which means every deck you run into playing a Pegasi is going to have a plan to beat you, and they may even have specific tech cards.
May even have. If you're a Pegasi, everybody's gunning for you. Everybody.
Well, some decks have good matchups into the Pegasi already. They don't need the tech cards. But for those that have bad matchups, oh yeah, absolutely. You better believe they're coming at you with some tech cards.
All right. So, who are some historical Pegasi? Not necessarily people right now in this meta, but just
Mhm.
heroes that have been very dominant at other points in the game.
Absolutely. So the quintessential example is Starvo. Starvo was just the meta terror for the entire time that Starvo was legal. That deck was oppressive, right? But a little bit more recently, you've had Lexi. Lexi was the dominant deck for quite a while, about 6 months. And there were a number of different decks that kind of came up to counter her, specifically because she was the best. Oldhim has been that in a number of metagames as well. And then finally, for a very brief time, Phi was also like, one of those big Pegasi before Belittle Minnowism got banned and before, Stubby Hammers, which with Stubby Hammers, that deck was
All right. Let's
nuts.
not get into the deep lore of Flesh and Blood. We'll say that yes, Phi was very, very dominant for his time and has now been reined in a little since. Um, so Zach, let's say you're gearing up for a tournament. You see that this is a Pegasi deck. It's clearly at the top of the meta. When should you bring a Pegasi to a tournament?
Yeah, so you should bring a Pegasi to the tournament if you're one of the higher skilled players in the room. You want that skill gap because you want to be able to beat people in the mirror match, right? And in order to have a consistent edge in the mirror match, you just need to be more skilled than your opponent. You also are okay bringing Pegasi if you're comfortable beating those tech choices, those specific game plans that people have tailored to try and beat you. If you're comfortable doing those things, you should bring a Pegasi.
Yeah, the mirror match thing is important. That's not always something people consider. Um, if you're bringing a Pegasi, it's often better to practice the head-to-head more than the matchups against the white horses and so on, because those will be the guaranteed high stakes encounters.
Absolutely.
Zach, when should you not bring a Pegasi? When is it a bad idea to bring the strongest deck in the format, or one of the strongest?
Yeah. So generally, if you don't have enough experience on the deck, or if you are a below average skill player in the room, then you shouldn't bring a Pegasi. So, for example, if this is your first Pro Tour, you've never been to a Pro Tour before, it's probably, and you want to win the event, you're probably going to have a harder time winning bringing a Pegasi because you're going to play against other players that are better than you and have an edge in that mirror than it is to bring a deck that has a naturally good matchup there and try to spike the event.
Yeah, it is dangerous to bandwagon and try to jump on a Megasi a Pegasi once it emerges from the meta. We'll talk about this more in depth when we get to specific heroes, but you should not assume just because a Pegasi is racking up wins in other tournaments that you should bring it. It's not always quite that simple.
Exactly.
All right, what about our second tier, white horses?
So white horses are going to be strong decks with a real meta presence that everybody knows are strong. They're going to be decks that can win tournaments. They've taken down tournaments before, but they don't have the same meta dominance or the same extreme win rates of the Pegasi.
All right, so who are some historical white horses? Strong decks that were never quite meta kings or meta terrors.
Yeah, so Icelander, for the majority of her career, was a white horse. She was a very strong deck, but she always had a couple weak matchups. Briar has been a very strong deck for a lot of her meta career and was, again, a white horse. Old Prism for a very large portion of her time, specifically around Pro Tour Lille, when Briar was the best deck. Prism was solid, but she was certainly not S tier or anything like that. And then most recently, Azalea has been a solid deck, good choice, but never quite super meta dominant in this most recent last couple of seasons.
All right. So if everybody, when they're building their decks, if everybody is gunning for the Pegasi, how are people thinking about the white horses in preparation for tournaments?
Yeah, so generally people are they're not going to specifically counter a white horse, but they are going to know that the white horses exist and they're going to have a plan in mind for that deck. Every serious contender in the room is going to have a plan to try and beat the white horses.
Okay, so you're getting ready for a tournament. When should you bring a white horse to the show?
So you should bring a white horse if you're familiar with it and you have a solid plan into the Pegasi. The biggest reason to bring a white horse is if you think you have a good matchup and you can beat the Pegasi in the meta.
All right, I will point out that showing up to the tournament and hoping to dodge bad matchups is not a plan. Do not do that.
Especially if those bad matchups are the Pegasi, because
Yeah,
they're the
the most
most
common
present.
decks.
Exactly.
So yeah, so when should you not bring a white horse? When is it a bad decision to bring a strong contender?
Uh, I mean, the biggest one is if it can't beat the Pegasi, right? If you can't beat the Pegasi in the room, if you have a really bad matchup into one of them, then you're just going to be losing, 20% of your matchups right out the gate statistically. And that's not a winning bet.
Okay, this third category is the most interesting. Zach, talk about our dark horses.
So a dark horse is a deck that's a lot stronger than it's given credit for. Dark horses, they might be more versatile or they might have more potential than the horses they're mistaken for, but they're very meta dependent. So oftentimes a deck can be a horse, so not super meta relevant for a long time, and then for just a brief window, they're a dark horse. If you take them and you bring them, you're targeting a specific weak point in the metagame that really gives you an edge.
Yeah. So these are typically underrated decks that can still come from behind and win tournaments. So like, who are some historical dark horses, decks that have just continually snagged tournaments when no one else thought they could do it? Maybe.
So the most high end example is Kano in Pro Tour One, where everybody was planning to beat Chain and all these other decks, and they didn't have Kano on their radar, and nobody brought enough AB, and Kano just shot all the way to the top eight. Right? Bolton is typically a dark horse deck. Now in this most recent meta, he's actually not in the dark horse category, but a lot of the times Bolton has fallen into that category where combo Bolton's really good at taking down, the Phi decks. So if you have a room filled with Phi, take combo Bolton. Dash IE is another great example where she just comes in every now and again and steals tournaments out of nowhere because nobody's fully prepared for her.
I think that's an important thing to consider, which is that the status of dark horse is extremely timing dependent. A hero can come in, be the dark horse in one tournament, clinch a win, and then 2 tournaments later they've become a Pegasi because everyone saw their victory and realized this hero was really cracked. Like who's an example of where that happened? Someone just shot out of obscurity and came and took the place over.
So a great example of that is Dromai in PT3. Dromai was an okay deck. Everybody was like, but specifically Mara Ferris built a list designed to crush the Lexis and did exactly that throughout the entire Pro Tour. 2 weeks later, everybody's like, man, now we got to be worried about Dromai. And Dromai went from exactly what you said, that dark horse to that white horse or even the Pegasi category.
So if people are gunning for the Pegasi and they're keeping in mind the white horses, what about the dark horses?
So dark horses are decks that they tech, but they're not teched against. So they have solid game plans into the Pegasi and the white horses, but they're not on everybody else's radar. So they might have some, very unfavorable matchups against the out of meta decks, but they're a good choice into all of the top meta decks, which what makes them a good choice for that event.
So often with dark horses, you are trading raw power or raw flexibility of the upper tier decks for surprise and for meta advantages, meta specific advantages that other people might not realize. Although Zach, this has diminishing returns up and down the ladder, right?
It definitely does. So the higher level of the tournament, the more likely it is that people have tested into your dark horse deck. Now, maybe you have some specific tech that's new, or maybe you have some card choices that are different, and that gives you an edge. But generally speaking, at the very top level of competition, these players have played against almost every deck. They have a plan into everything. So you're not going to get as much surprise there. You need to have a decent matchup in that case.
Okay. So let's say you're looking around, you think you've found a dark horse, or something that could really have some upset potential. When should you bring that to a tournament?
So the first thing is if you're a specialist on this deck and you see a meta opening, right? A moment where the meta, if you're a Kano specialist and everybody's cutting their AB, okay, this is the moment to go, right? Uh, or if you're good with a variety of decks and you think that this one is perfectly placed because you've tested with all of them and everything that's in the top of the meta seems to keep losing to this one deck, that might be a perfect moment to take that as a dark horse.
Okay, and what if you're good with a lot of decks?
So if you're good with a lot of decks, and you want to make sure that you don't delude yourself into thinking that your pet deck is a dark horse, right? So
Heartbreaking
decks,
every time.
absolutely. The meta decks are so far. If the meta decks are like super far ahead of the pack, it doesn't matter how prepared you are for them if their numbers are just substantially better than yours. So you really want to be careful about deluding yourself, but you're perfectly fine to bring a dark horse deck if you play a bunch and you say, "Hey, this meta feels perfectly positioned for this specific deck." That's a great time to bring one.
Yeah, the greatest enemy of dark horses are not Pegasi, it is wishful thinking. So a good thing to keep in mind. Um,
Well, it's misidentifying, right? It's
yeah,
identifying something as a dark horse when it's actually a horse.
and identifying dark horses is actually its own skill. It is much easier done in retrospect than in the moment.
Yep.
Uh,
And remember, if you're bringing a dark horse, it's an all-in bet.
yeah.
It is a you are taking your shot, right? But that means if the meta doesn't come out the way you predicted, you're at a severe disadvantage just from the offset.
Yeah. Let's talk about a much simpler category. Let's talk about horses.
Okay. So
Bog standard.
horses, yep, horses are exactly what they say they are. A horse is a known quantity deck with a linear game plan that might be powerful but doesn't have a lot of flexibility. So these are decks that they sit down, they play the same kind of game into their different matchups every single time.
Who are some classic horses?
So classic horses would include decks like Bravo. Bravo has very set matchups and game plans for most of the decks he's going to encounter, and he executes those game plans every single time. Dorinthia is a deck that has a very similar, a similar thing there. She has certain plans into each matchup, and she executes those. Rhinar is another one like that. And then for most of his career, Katsu has also been a deck like that, where he's more aggro than the rest, but he's a very I have this plan. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I execute.
Now I know horses are often looked down on, but Zach, you think horses are a good idea for a lot of players. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think that if you're a below average skill player, so if you're someone, like I said, if you're new to the Pro Tour, this is your first time coming into the Pro Tour, playing a horse can actually be a big advantage because horses are generally a little bit simpler or easier to play
Now,
than some of the decks on these higher
when
tiers.
he
Go ahead.
says below average skill, he doesn't mean of the entire flesh and blood player base. He means in the specific tournament. If you get into
Correct.
a tournament and you know you kind of lucked into it, maybe, or if you're new to the scene, that's when you might be thinking about horses when you're not sure you can go head to head with the best of the people in the room.
Exactly, right? For your locals, you don't have to worry about that. Like they're your locals, right? You're not going to have to worry about being a below average skill player, right? We're talking about, hey, this is your first pro tour. You've never done a big tournament like this, so you're a little nervous and you're definitely not sure where you stack up, right? But anytime you're playing one of these decks, they tend to be a little bit easier to play because of their linear game plans, which means that you can free up some mental resources to think about other things. You can try to think about things like reading your opponent, signs and tells. You can try and get your advantages from other areas that aren't just, hey, this deck is powerful.
Yeah, I think it's underrated that even just physically, a tournament is a long day. And if you're playing a deck that requires 100% of your mental energy, you can just break your brain in 3 matches and still have, a dozen more ahead of you. So it is good to think about your mental energy, and that's a muscle you can build up over time, and horses are good at making that happen.
Yep.
Um,
Fatigue is a real thing. And, additionally, like you can take that excess mental energy and focus on other things during the game, right? You can start calculating probabilities. You have a bunch of different things you can try and figure out because your turn is mostly figured out when you draw your hand and you see what cards you have.
okay, so we like horses here. Nothing wrong with the old reliable horse. But Zach, when
Exactly.
should you not bring a horse to a tournament?
Yeah. So if you're trying to win that tournament and you can confidently play a white horse or a Pegasi, you probably shouldn't be bringing a horse, right? It's about as simple as that.
Yeah, it's stronger and more versatile decks are better if you can handle them.
Exactly.
Uh, so Zach, tell us about the donkeys. Poor souls.
So donkeys, these are decks that are just as bad as people think they are. They're just a bad deck. They don't have a lot of hidden potential, or they have just some matchups that are straight unwinnable. They're just they're the bottom of the pack.
So the crucial thing here is that dark horses and some horses can skate by with a little luck and a little preparation. There is no amount of luck and no amount of preparation that is going to let a donkey win in a tournament. Um,
Agreed.
so then, when should you bring a donkey to a tournament?
So you should bring a donkey if it's your favorite deck and you don't care about winning, or if it's the only deck you own.
Which, hey, that's respectable. People go to
Yeah,
tournaments for all reasons. Um,
if you want to be known as the Teklo person, by all means, bring Teklo, have fun.
Also, and it is important to consider these things can shift, right? So maybe you bring a deck that's a donkey in 3 tournaments, and then a new card set drops with some new cards for you, and the meta shifts, and all of a sudden your donkey's become a dark horse. So there's
Yep.
something to be said for accumulating skill with a specific deck, even if there's not a lot of reward for it for quite a while, maybe.
Yeah,
Um,
a great example of that is Levi Roush playing Azalea throughout all of time and space until suddenly Codex of Frailty is printed, and all of a sudden Azalea is a great deck,
Yeah,
right?
you're not guaranteed to get the last laugh, but it's hella satisfying when it happens. But we're
Exactly.
we're making the optimistic case. When should you not bring a donkey to a tournament?
If you care about winning and you have any better deck that you can bring.
Yeah, that's simple. Unfortunately, there's got to be a bottom of every list, and we're looking at it
Yep.
right now. So
Exactly.
those are our broad categories. We have Pegasi at the top, strong white horses, dark horses with potential, regular workhorses, and just the bottom of the list. So we're going to order things by, we're going to group them by tier. We'll start with the Pegasi and work our way down. We're also going to organize things by complexity. The idea being that just because a deck is good does not mean you can pick up and play it or take home a tournament, with 4 games on Talishar. Some
Yep.
decks are only good and only perform at a high level if you know the deck and have a ton of practice on it.
Yep.
So Zach, how are you going to be ranking complexity of decks?
So I've created a little bit of a little scale, a sliding scale from 1 to 10 on the complexity of the decks, and I've kind of put everybody where I think they fall. Now, complexity is definitely very subjective. So some people are going to find a deck, more difficult or easier than other decks, and that's completely fine. The goal here is just to give you a general idea of where they fall in that complexity category and how much investment you need to put in the deck to see the results that you're looking for.
Yeah. So how much time would you need to play let's say like 80th percentile, a 1 complexity deck versus a 10 complexity deck?
So for a one complexity deck, and now I want to be clear here, we have a baseline assumption that we have to make, which is that you're familiar with Flesh and Blood and you know how to play the game, right? If you don't know how to play the game, there's a whole set of other skills you have to learn first, right? But assuming you know all of the basics about Flesh and Blood and some of the more advanced stuff like pitch stacking, things like that, and are familiar with them, you don't have to do them incredibly, just familiar with them. A one complexity deck would probably take you somewhere between 5 and 10 games to play at an 80% mastery.
All right.
So a very low number of games. You could get those in Talishar in a week.
All right. What about a 10, like the most complex?
So a 10 is going to take a very large number of games. We're talking probably somewhere around 200 games to really figure out all of the nuts and bolts of the deck because those decks have a lot of moving pieces. There's a number of varying decision paths and things like that. It has, and no game plays out the same. So you can't just create a heuristic and say, oh, I've seen this situation. I'm going to do this. You very rarely come into the same identical situations with these decks.
Yeah. We'll also mention we're not just going to be thinking about time investment. We're also going to be thinking about regular investment. Flesh and Blood can be a very expensive game, and some decks will be very cheap but have specific cards that are very, very expensive. So we'll be talking about
Exactly.
budget versions of each hero and whether or not they'll stay in the same rank we give them if you're missing, say, the 3 most expensive cards. Because sometimes it can be very deceptive, and one, $300 card can make a huge difference in a deck.
Yeah,
Um,
Crown of Seeds for Oldhim. If you
yeah,
didn't have
great
Crown of
example.
Seeds, Oldhim dropped 1 or 2 tier points just without that one card.
And how much did Crown of Seeds cost in its heyday?
In its heyday, somewhere around $150.
Yeah. So we're going to be keeping that in mind as well because we know all kinds of people play Flesh and Blood, and all kinds of people are interested in competing. But with that, we're going to get started with our Pegasi at the current moment. So Zach, in case people are watching this later, we're recording this now on the night of Saturday the 16th. Where are we in kind of the tournament timeline?
Yeah, so we are 1 week out, in fact, less than a week out from Pro Tour Los Angeles. Pro Tour Los Angeles will start next Friday. And then after Pro Tour Los Angeles, we'll have a small break. And then the Pro Quest season and then the national season will start right after that.
Okay, great. So we'll start out with those in the air. We're going to say the least complex of the Pegasi is Victor
Victor.
Goldmane. Zach, why is this peacock here at the top of our tier list?
So the truth is that just Victor has great numbers. Victor is one of the most efficient decks in the game, and he just outvalues his opponents on most turn cycle bases. So he is just better numbers, very consistent, and a very solid number-based game plan into every matchup he plays. Victor does have some weaker matchups, specifically the decks that have a lot of setup involved. So decks like Prism or decks like Dromai give him a really hard time because they have these permanent based game plans that are hard for Guardians to deal with. But overall, Victor is a great deck because he just has better numbers than the rest of the decks in the format. It's as simple as that.
Now, Zach, do you think there's going to be any balance changes like midway through the season that might shake things up?
I don't think so. I don't think Victor's in any way a problematic spot. I think in terms of overall strength, he's definitely a Pegasi, but I'd actually say he's probably the weakest of the three Pegasi. I don't think there's going to be any balance shifts that need to be made here, but Victor is a very powerful deck with a very strong baseline. That's the biggest thing that you need to understand here. His baseline is higher than most other decks because his numbers are just that solid.
So, what complexity would you give him? You said it's on the low end, but how low?
So I have Victor rated at a 1. There's an argument for like a 2 or 3. Uh, in
Like a
general,
1, like the least complex in the game or among
yes,
them?
yes, or among them.
Jesus.
Among them, there are I think 3 decks that can fall into that least complex category, and Victor is one of those 3. Where you put the other 2 is kind of up for debate, but they're all in that very bottom tier category. And the reason for that is that Victor's cards are very self-explanatory. They all serve a specific role. So when you draw your hand of 3 blues and a red, well, you know what card you're attacking with. It's the red. And if you have any extra stuff, you know what you're blocking with. It's the excess blues. Now, there's some nuance to saying, hey, I need to block with this blue instead of like this 6 power blue instead of this 8 power blue against Prism because I need the extra power for popping. But for the most part, you look at your hand, you say, hey, these cards block, these cards attack. That's it. That's my game plan. It's there's a lot less decision trees and branching pathways. You still need to be able to pitch stack. You still need to be able to do a lot of the stuff that makes Fab as a game complex. But Victor's overall game plans are not specifically or are not terribly difficult to enact.
All right. So Zach, I know we caution people about bandwagoning onto Pegasi and getting in over their heads, but in this case, would you recommend someone straight bandwagon onto Victor if they're a decent Flesh and Blood player? Like, will those raw numbers make up for a lack of expertise for maybe not playing him that often?
If you are trying to pick a deck with a very strict time limit, I think Victor is probably your best choice. Absolutely. Now, if you've got a little bit more time and can devote a little bit more, I think the other two Pegasi have slightly better matchup spreads and are more rewarding if you have the time to master them. But on a short timeline, absolutely, Victor is by far the simplest of the top three decks to pick up and will still result in a very solid win rate because he just is a solid all around deck.
Okay. What about budget Victor? How expensive is it to get a top tier Victor Goldman deck?
So the biggest hurdle to getting a Victor deck is Fandel Spring Tunic, right? Which is going to
A
be
hurdle to a lot of decks.
yeah, that's going to be a hurdle to a lot of these decks going forward. Just to be very clear, Command and Conquer, which is a very important card in all of the Guardian decks, right? Having Command and Conquer Pommel is super important. And then after that, it's going to be some of the class legendaries or the headpiece, the generic headpiece. So Crown of Providence, right? Um, if you remove Crown of Providence, Fiendel Spring Tunic, for Fiendels, you can just get a Tectonic Plating. And it's going to be almost as good. Not quite, but almost. Crown of Providence, that's a lot harder to replace. That's going to probably drop you down a tier. That card is just fantastic. Arcanite Skullcap is a decent replacement, but it requires you to be on lower life, and it increases how hard it is to play in different matchups. And then your last one is Command and Conquer. You need Command and Conquer. Command and Conquer is some of your best disruption in the deck, and it gives you tools against the aggro decks to force them to block with cards, which you just desperately need. Command and Conquer is one that you're just not going to be able to get around. So without a Command and Conquer, you're going to drop at least a tier, maybe another, maybe two.
Okay, great. Okay, that is our first Pegasi. Now let's talk about a newcomer to the scene, KO, Armed and Dangerous.
Okay, so
What's this guy's deal?
KO is KO is the best aggro deck in the format, right? In every format, you have an aggro deck that just puts the pressure on and tells people you can't take time to set up. KO is that deck for this format. KO's got great numbers and is a very aggressive deck. He's good on the offense. The difficulty for KO is that his defensive play is a little bit hampered. Not a lot. He's still got a lot of 3 blocks, but he's got less of them than something like Victor, right? For Victor, every card blocks 3. For KO, and some of them block 4. For KO, you've got 2 blocks. You even have cards that can't block at all, which means that you need to have the tempo and keep the tempo for most of the game. That's the big caveat with KO. If you can do that, you're going to win a lot of your matches.
Okay, who does KO need to be worried about though? Who makes him have rely on that defensive game plan?
So KO has a couple of matchups that are rough. The biggest ones, Kano is a difficult matchup for KO because Kano kind of attacks on a completely different axis. It's by no means bad, but KO has a lighter blue count for his resource curve. So he's got about 21 blues, and most of his attacks cost 2 or 3, which means that very rarely do you have excess resources on your turn, which gives Kano great windows to get chip damage in and combo and kill you. The other deck that KO has a pretty hard time into is Bolton. Bolton's actually the Warriors in general all give KO a hard time, and the reason the Warriors give KO a hard time is they have a great fridge, so they can stop his limited on hits.
Fridge meaning very good armor.
Correct. They have very good armor, so they can block his limited on hits very easily, and they have comparable numbers, but their cards are more versatile. So if they need to go on offense, they can, but if they need to play defense, they can. KO can really only play one of those two.
So Warriors are bet can beat him in the mid range easier than other
Exactly.
decks. Okay.
Exactly.
So, what is KO's complexity? 1 to
So
10.
I've got KO as a 5. I think KO is a reasonably difficult deck to play, and a lot of that is based on variance mitigation. So brutes as a class are built on variance enhancing mechanics, like drawing a card off the top of your deck and then discarding it and getting a bonus if you discard a 6. That means if you don't hit a 6, you don't get that benefit, right? So your cards are below rate in some cases because you didn't hit that 6. So there's some inherent variance built into brute, and knowing how to mitigate that variance to maximize your consistent damage output is what separates the good group brute players from the great brute players.
Okay. How much of that complexity, though, is just in deck building versus in actual moment-to-moment gameplay?
Oh, so I actually think that most of that is in moment to moment gameplay.
Interesting.
KO specifically takes a lot of the deck building variance out because he bumps all of the blue 5s to 6s. That's one of his hero abilities. So that means that you have a much higher density of 6s than other heroes. But here's a good example scenario. If you have a Blood Rush Bellows turn, Blood Rush giving all your brute attacks +2, and then you follow it up with a Wild Ride. Wild Ride says draw a card, then discard. If you discard a 6, it gains go again. Let's say you have all 6s in your hand. You can draw a non-6 off the top and then discard it, and that has now ended what is supposed to be your most powerful turn of the game because you didn't mitigate the variance, right? So you have to be able to account in every hand for the amount of variance that is still left in your deck. How many non-6s do I have, and how badly does it affect me if I draw and discard the non-6 here?
All right. So you can't just net deck a winning KO list and then cruise your way to glory.
Yeah,
Probably.
you need some practice, like figuring out how to handle those variance situations and the best way to sequence so that that variance doesn't cause you to lose the game.
All right. But in general, KO has a pretty straightforward game plan, even if there's a lot of details, and he's just got the numbers to back it up, correct?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay. What about budget KO? How easy is it to build him without a few key cards, maybe?
Well, surprisingly, KO, one of the most expensive cards in KO is Fiendel Spring Tunic. This is going to be a very recurring theme. Another one of KO's most expensive cards is Command and Conquer. Go figure. Now, that is actually the majority of his really expensive stuff. The last one is one of the new ones. It's a new brute arm piece. The new brute legendary arms. That is also a relatively expensive piece, but it's less than both Command and Conquer and Fiendel Spring Tunic. Without Command and Conquer, you lose some of your disruptive capabilities into the aggro decks, but you're still better numbers than them, so you're still relatively okay. You don't have to have Command and Conquer. You can substitute other much cheaper but still powerful on hits like Humble or Erase Face, and still have a very competitive KO deck. Losing Spring Tunic hurts a lot, but Heart and Cross Strap is still a very powerful card and helps you, and you play it in a lot of your aggro matchups or your hyper defensive matchups anyway. So it's still, you don't need Spring Tunic to be competitive. All in all, if you don't have any of the expensive cards for KO, he probably drops down a tier, but no more than that. He's much more effective at playing at a budget level or a semi-budget level than these other decks.
Okay. Let's talk about our third Pegasi, Lady Dromai. What's your game?
Okay, so Dromai is a permanent based setup plan. So she floods the board with dragons, and then she uses those dragons to deal her damage. Now, there are two different variations of Dromai. There's your big dragon Dromai, and then there's your aggressive Dromai. Talking about Pegasi, I would tell you the S tier version or the best version is the aggro Dromai because it puts pressure on all of the decks and doesn't give them the time to breathe. Whereas Big Dragon Dromai is much more defensive, which I think actually doesn't play to Dromai's character strengths or hero strengths as her hero abilities list, right? So Dromai has a couple bad matchups. The worst thing for Dromai to ever see, the two things that struggles into the most are brutes and ninjas. The ninjas are much more of a bad matchup than the brutes, actually. And ninjas are, as you'll see later, not super prevalent in this meta, which is what gives Dromai which is what makes Dromai one of the best decks to pick. Brutes are difficult, but very winnable, especially if you're on that aggro plan and you can play on a similar numbers axis that they can, right? The big dragon deck relying on the dragons is really what hurts it in the brute matchup because all of a sudden, they can pop all your dragons, right? They have the ability to trigger that phantasm, so they can block with a 6, and your dragon is now destroyed, and your turn ends. And that's something that is very hard to deal with when you're focused on the dragon plan. But when you have an aggro backup plan, the aggro variant, you're not as worried about that.
All right, so Zach, Dromai has been a very consistent white horse for a long time now. What gave her wings and let her lead the pack? Was it just meta shifts, or was it new cards? Why is she here in the lead now?
So it is exactly meta shifts. The ninjas are the worst they've been in a long time. Mostly because actually of Victor. Victor eats ninjas for lunch. They have a very very bad matchup into Victor, which means that they're much less likely to win an event since Victor is a large portion of the metagame. So with the ninjas going down, Dromai gets a massive boost because they're her main predator, right? So Dromai has no matchups that are severely unfavored at this point. She has some matchups that are slightly unfavored, and that's about it.
Okay, so how would you rank the complexity of the Ash Artist here?
So I would put Dromai at about a 6 complexity. I've got her above both KO and Victor. I think she's the hardest of the Pegasi to learn because there is a lot of nuance in understanding which dragons are good in which situations. Your zero, if you're talking about the aggro variant specifically, which I'm going to mostly focus on that, the 0 for 4s are pretty self explanatory. They're 0 for 4s, you throw them at your opponent, they're above rate attacks, hit them, do damage. It's pretty good.
Now,
The
an above rate means just better than the standard power level of a card in the situations they're
Correct.
played, right?
Correct. Above rate means better than. For limited, it's 3. For classic constructed, 3.5 is about the average rate of a card. So anything that's coming in as a one card 4 is generally above rate. So the aggro variant of Dromai has a lot of 0 for 4s, so they're very above rate. And then she has the dragon package. And the reason Dromai's got a 6 complexity is that it's difficult to figure out when to play which dragons and what matchups what dragons are relevant in each matchup. Right, Rake the Embers. It's much better against the Guardians than it is a deck like the Ninjas that can kill them very easily.
Okay, so budget Dromai, how does that go?
So, unfortunately, the most expensive card in Dromai is Flamescale Furnace, and then Command and Conquer. Now we don't need Spandal Spring Tunic for this deck, so that's a big benefit. But instead, we need Flamescale Furnace, which is another chest piece. And then Command and Conquer is, again, one of these staples you're gonna see that a lot. Those are the two most expensive cards in the deck, and then your last expensive card is going to be Balance of Justice, one of the new head pieces. Uh, Without Balance of Justice is really there to help your brute matchups and make your brute matchups better. That's really what it's there for. Losing Balance of Justice definitely hurts your brute matchup and makes your Pegasus status kind of come into question since there's a lot of brutes. You'll probably drop down a tier just by losing balance for the brute matchup. Flamescale Furnace is essential. You need that card to play this deck. Without Flamescale Furnace, this deck gets markedly worse. We're talking down to the level of a horse, probably. That card is essential for the operations of the deck. It's one of your best ways to generate ash. It gives you additional resources on your big turns. It's kind of just the most important equipment piece in Dromai.
So
And then
unfortunately, you need Flamescale Furnace to play Dromai at a competitive level.
pretty much,
Yeah.
yes. Now, as for Command and Conquer is a little less important. This is actually similar to KO. You can switch out Command and Conquer for something like Humble or Erase Face and get mostly the same results. You don't really need Command and Conquer specifically, so you do have that going for you. But you have to have Flamescale Furnace in order to play this
Okay, so these are our three our Pegasi.
deck.
They're Meta Kings and a Meta Queen, but these are not Meta Terrors, right? We don't have one Pegasi that is so far ahead of the pack. They're just going to murder everyone beneath them, right?
Exactly.
There's
There's
no
no
Lexi.
Lexi in this meta. There's no Starvo in this meta. These decks are all very, very good, but the next, like the top of the white horses has almost as many wins as these Pegasi.
All right. Well, since before we move on, since these are probably going to be the three most played decks, what are their matchups into each other? Because if you bring
Yeah.
one, you're probably going to see the others, or even if you don't, pretty frequently.
Yep, absolutely. So your Victor has a bad matchup into KO and a bad matchup into Dromai.
So Victor loses the Pegasi, the air race.
Victor loses the air race, which is why I think Victor is the weakest of the three Pegasi. KO has a good matchup into him because KO's numbers are really, really good, and Victor doesn't have enough disruption to stop his numbers from being
So
good.
KO can
And
just go all out.
exactly, and Dromai, the setup plan is just insanely good into Guardians. Guardians have very few ways to handle multiple dragons, which makes that a really tough matchup for Victor. So overall, Victor's got the worst in this, winners metagame here. KO has a good matchup into actually both Victor and Dromai. KO's kind of the top dog there. His Dromai matchup's really close, and there are, with tech choices, Dromais can get that close to 50-50, maybe even slightly favored if the KO doesn't know what they're doing. But in general, KO should be slightly favored into Dromai. He's got the aggression and he's got a multitude of poppers to really help solidify that matchup. That really takes some of the offense out of the Dromai's abilities. Finally, Dromai, good into Victor, very close but slightly unfavored into KO.
How does she do against the field, though?
So that's the big thing. Dromai has a great matchup against most of the rest of the field. Almost all of the decks that beat KO have a really, really hard time into Dromai. Specifically, when we talked about KO, we said he had a hard time into Warriors. Warriors hate seeing a Dromai across the table. And that's why Dromai has such a good, is so prevalent here in this top winners metagame right now.
All right. So when it's a close race and the white horses and the Pegasi maybe have very similar play rates, Victor and Dromai will be better picks. But if the Pegasi start pulling away from the others, KO will be a better pick because he is favored into the other two.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay, that's a good thing to be thinking about as the season progresses and the meta stabilizes a little bit. So let's move along. Is there anything else you wanted to say about our Pegasi, Zach?
Nope, I think that about covers it.
All right, let's move along to our white horses, our strong contenders. The first one we have is a newcomer, at least to Classic Constructed, Kasai the Golden Sands.
So Kasai is a very solid mid-range deck. That's it. Kasai has the most consistent turn-to-turn plan of any deck in the entire game. She is very, very, very good at doing a consistent 4-card 15. That's what she does. She does it super well. That's it. She doesn't have widely ranging matchups for the most part, with two exceptions. Illusionists, so those permanent base setup plans, are really hard for her to deal with. And then wizards. Wizards are really tough for her too. So Kano is a very it's a substantially it's a really bad matchup. It's like 30-70 for Kasai. It's bad.
So anybody wearing a dress, she should take off running.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, because dress or robe. Okay,
Sure.
wizards wear robes.
Flowy garment.
Well, okay, you can't say that because Fandel Spring Tunic is like worn by everybody, and that's like a robe. So I don't know,
It's a good point. It's a good point.
man.
All right. So what about the Pegasi? How does Kasai do in 2R3?
So
You said poor
Kasai,
Dromai. What about the others?
yep. So very poor Dromai. She's actually good into KO. She's favored into KO. She is
Okay.
one of those decks that I was talking about just a second ago that beat up on KO but lose to Dromai. And then her Victor match is very close. There's a lot of dependence on that one ranges a little bit based on how many defense reactions the Victor runs. The more defense reactions the Victor runs, the more it's in the Victor's favor.
Okay. What about complexity for Kasai?
I've got Kasai at about a 3 complexity. I think she is a little bit harder than some of the easiest decks in the game to play, but I don't think she's particularly difficult because her plan is predominantly number based. So
Okay.
most of your cards, you're just looking to see, or most of your hands, you're just looking to see what is the best numbers this hand produces. if I block with these two cards and throw and play these two? Is it if I block with no cards and play all four, or is it if I block with all four cards? And then you do that line. It's very rare that you want to take a line that doesn't just present the best numbers you can with Kasai.
Simple math heroes. It's why I love warriors. Um,
Exactly.
Zach, what about budget Kasai? She's pretty new, right?
She is pretty new. So budget Kasai actually doesn't run Fiendel Spring Tunic. She does have a different chest piece called Grains of Blood Spill. It's the new warrior chest piece, and that card is relatively expensive. So you've got that. Then you've got her headpiece, which is going to be Crown of Providence or Balance of Justice, and both of those are pretty pricey. And then your last one is going to be Valiant Dynamos. So the chest piece can be a bit flexible, right? Courage of Bladehold is a much cheaper card, and it still offers a lot of the. It doesn't offer as much power as Grains, but it's still a close second, right? It's a much better replacement than anything else you're going to find, and you won't lose too many win percentage points there. The headpieces, there's not a great replacement for them outside of, again, Arcanite Skullcap. And again, it's similar. You'll lose some percentage points, but not a lot. So in both the head and the chest, you're mostly okay to go with budget options. The big one is Valiant Dynamos. Valiant Dynamos is the reason that Kasai can consistently output 15-point value turns, because Valiant Dynamos blocks for one, and then you swing with both your swords, and it blocks for one again. So you continue to get this extra point of armor block every turn that lets you outvalue your opponents. Valiant Dynamos is very important to the deck. Without Valiant Dynamos, you're definitely going to drop down probably 2 tiers.
Okay, let's talk about Sir Boltyn. Now, I'm personally pretty happy to see this. I understand Boltyn has ranged all up and down this tier list. I think he's gone from Donkey to Dark Horse and there and back. What is it about now that makes Sir Boltyn, all the way up in the white horses? What changed?
Well, I'm going to give you a quick counterpoint. I don't know if Sir Boltyn has ever quite hit the Pegasi tier. So he
Okay,
may not have gone all the way up and down this tier list.
but
Uh,
let's be optimistic. We'll say he has momentum. He's shooting up.
He'll get there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
He'll
one
get there,
day,
of course, of
someday.
course. So Bolton is a white horse right now because he has just very good plans into most of the top decks. Bolton's hero ability means that any deck with a large number of attack actions has a very difficult time blocking him. And as you'll see from the rest of our tier list here, most of the top decks are decks that are very attack action heavy, which means Bolton has a pretty good plan into them. So overall, Bolton is an interesting deck in that he has multiple plans. He actually has there's a hybrid list of Bolton that plays both the combo plan and the Raiden plan, and that's the deck I'm going to be talking about right now. If you're going to focus on one or the other, you're going to introduce additional weaknesses. By having access to both plans, you actually cover up a lot of the weaknesses that Bolton has.
So you think
Uh,
Bolton can have it both ways? He doesn't need to specialize.
I do. I do think that Bolton can have it both ways because most of your cards are consistent across both plans. The only exceptions to that are actually equipment. Most of the combo plan relies on the equipment that you present, which means that it's only 3 to 5 slots. So it's not nearly as much as a lot of these other hybrid decks that you have.
Okay, so his strength is in the Pegasi. How does he square up against R3?
So he actually has a very solid matchup into Victor. Generally, the plan there is to just triple Lumina them. So Lumina is his specialization card. It lets your weapons get an additional attack. You play combo Bolton, and you just attack 8 times with your weapons for a total of 48 damage, and Victor dies. It's crazy.
Okay,
48 damage kills almost anybody. Um,
KO.
KO, you play a solid mid-range plan, and because all of his cards now block for 2 or 1, he has a really hard time blocking you. So you just get a lot of good offensive output. So you and he are both racing, but you can block and he can't, which gives you a lot of edge. And then finally, Dromai. Dromai is the one bad matchup you have in that top bracket. Dromai is the deck you are least hoping to see of probably not just the top bracket, but probably the entire tournament. Dromai is not a great matchup for you, and it's definitely one you'd prefer to not play against.
So we've warned against dodging bad matchups as a plan. Would you say if Dromai starts posting good results and her play rate starts going up, Bolton should be a less and less appealing as a pick, at least if you're really trying to be competitive?
That's exactly correct. Now, I do want to be clear that Bolton's matchup into Dromai isn't as bad as like Kasai and Takeno. So Bolton can still win that matchup. It's probably 40-60, but Bolton can still win the matchup. The thing that that I would tell you though is you're not going to consistently win that matchup, and that's what makes it difficult. So if you're bringing Bolton, you really want to bring Bolton into a room where you think there's going to be less Dromai, or the Dromai are going to get beaten, so that you can and you're not, so you can continue to progress.
Okay, so how complex is Bolton? Let's say you're picking him up for the first time. How's it going to go?
I've got Bolton at about a 4. So I think he's more complex. I think he sits right between a 4 and a 5. A lot of his cards are very versatile, which means you have a lot of options with his hands. But most of he's really centered around his power cards. So he's got a set of like 3 power cards that you really want to focus on playing, and that's how you kind of maximize Bolton. Which means that a lot of your plans are okay, present good numbers until I find my power card. When I find my power card, have a take 1 turn to set it up, maybe I arsenal it and wait for my tunic counter or whatever, and then play my Via the Vanguard and present overwhelming numbers my opponent can't handle.
So as long as you know when it's go time, you're most of the way there with Bolton.
Exactly.
Okay, budget
Same
Bolton.
with combo.
Yeah. What's he need?
So Bolton really, really, really likes Vandal Spring Tunic.
And how much is Fandles going for at the moment?
I think the cheapest version is sitting somewhere around $80 to $85, and that is the most recent printing. If you're trying to get one of the rainbow foil printings, you're looking
It's
at
a lot more.
120. Yeah, you're
Okay.
looking at 120 now. So Vandal Spring Tunic's a big one. A lot of Bolton lists play Command and Conquer, so that's another one that we've talked about a lot already. And then after that, your next most expensive piece is going to be Warband of Bologna or Iron Song Versus, both of which are not very expensive. Warband of Bologna Rainbow Foil basic version is like $30, $40. Same with Iron Song Versus, 20 to 30. So really, you only have 2 cards that are expensive. You have your Fandle Spring or two cards. You have your Fandle Spring Tunic and then your 3 Command and Conquers. That's really the big thing. Now, in terms of replacement, Command and Conquer is actually very easy to replace in this deck. Command and Conquer is good because you can come in with a 7 breakpoint, but there are other on hits, like we talked about already in this video, Humble, Erase Face, that do a similar thing, or something like Cadaverous Contraband to get back your Luminous Ascension. They do a similar thing without without being too much worse than Command and Conquer. So you don't really need Command and Conquer as heavily. Fandle Spring Tunic is very important, and it's very
Okay.
important because you want to be able to play V of the Vanguard without having to pitch a card, so you can have your big V turns,
Yeah.
and that's the sticking point
Definitely noticing a pattern with equipment. I'm sure that will continue as we move down.
here. Absolutely.
Let's move along to Dash Inventor Extraordinaire, the original Dash.
Yeah, so Dash Adventure Extraordinaire is another one of those decks with a really powerful hybrid game plan. She plays both she has like a control game plan for the Guardians, and then she has like an aggro game plan for the aggro decks. She's a very solid deck. She's very good all around. Most of her cards block for 3. She's just got really solid numbers, and she's got good. The big thing for her is she's got good plans into most of the meta, and that's the thing that matters for her.
Okay, great. Let's talk about the Pegasi first off then. How does she do?
So into Victor, if she's playing the pistol item setup plan, which is what she needs to be doing to win that matchup, she's actually very favored. With the pistol item plan, she's looking at like a 70-30 matchup. It's very good for her. She has a lot of ability to win that matchup.
Okay, KO.
KO is a lot closer. And honestly, of all the things that mechanologists are facing right now, KO is probably like brutes in general are probably the hardest. Brutes are the only class that have a lot of cards that are teched to beat mechanologists. So cards that say destroy this item, do this thing. And that means that the stuff that Dash wants to set up is much harder to set up. Also, they have enough 3 blocks that they can still fatigue the deck if they try to go aggro. So the worst matchups that mechanologists are facing in this meta are the brutes. This is her worst. This is her hardest matchup of the S tier for sure.
Okay, what about Dragon Lady?
She actually has an all right game plan into Dragon Lady going pistol package. So if she's going the pistol package again, it's very easy for her to clear the dragons. And then she can kind of just take the game slowly and whittle the Dromite down. She's pretty good at doing that. So she's actually pretty reasonable into Dromite.
Okay, great. What's her complexity?
Uh, I've got Dash as a 4 complexity, similar to Bolton, but for a very different reason. The biggest difficulty with Dash is understanding how to manipulate your deck size. So Dash, all of her cards have the boost mechanic. Boost banishes the top card of your deck in order to give a card go again. What that means is you're using your deck as a resource. So you really have to understand your resource management with your deck in order to be effective with Dash. If you don't play with that deck size very carefully, you'll fatigue in matchups that you should win. And that's where the real skill of being a good Dash player comes in.
Okay, great. What about Budget Dash? Does she have any of the usual suspects?
She does have one of the usual suspects in Crown of Providence at the head slot.
All right.
Outside
How
of that,
replaceable is that?
Crown of Providence with Arcanite Skullcap, pretty replaceable, honestly. So it's not a huge loss to her. And then she has Teklo Foundry Heart, which is a mechanologist specific. Teklo Foundry Heart is less replaceable, certainly, but still not like impossible to replace. Overall, Dash is less affected by her budget constraints than most of the other heroes on this list. She'd probably drop down a single tier, but that's much more doable than a lot of these others.
Okay, so Dash is a good budget contender to keep in mind. Um,
Absolutely.
Sounds great. So you were heaping a whole lot of slander on our poor ninjas. Why is it then that Katsu is a white horse?
So Katsu is actually doing really well in this
Yeah, and
metagame.
that's new for him, right? He has not often been leading the charge.
That's new for him. In fact, in most of the previous metagames, almost all of them, all the ones that I can think of, was actually the better ninja, right? Fi just had more consistent numbers. But in this metagame specifically, Katsu, there's a new build of Katsu that is using Mask of the Pouncing Lynx to tutor up Bonds of Ancestry, which lets him have these massive, really long combat chains that do an insane amount of damage. So Katsu is playing closer to a combo deck than he ever has before, and he's seeing a lot of success for it. Katsu actually has, in this current metagame, a pretty good matchup into most of the top tier heroes, the big exception being Victor Goldmane. Victor Goldmane is a brutal matchup for Katsu. Katsu has a very, very, very hard time beating Victor. Um, Other than that, Katsu's actually in a pretty decent spot. He's great into Dromai. He's pretty good into KO because KO doesn't like blocking. He has a bit of difficulty into Kasai. That's the other one. So Victor and Kasai are his two bad matchups. Everybody else on this list, Katsu actually is doing pretty well into, and everybody else that we'll kind of talk about, Katsu's got a reasonable matchup into. The only other deck, so the third deck that he has a hard time with is Azalea. And that's just true for all aggro decks that don't block well. So
Okay, so why? All right, so Katsu is, you said you have him at a 5 on complexity. Why is that? What makes him ahead of the mechanologist and the warrior?
So while both the warriors are mostly figuring out the numbers of their hand, and the mechanologist is really just keeping track of the number of cards in their deck, Katsu has decision trees. Katsu's ability allows him to tutor any card with combo, which means that you can put your hand together in a number of different ways. Most of the time, it is correct to follow the combo line that gets you Bonds of Ancestry. That is generally the correct line. So a lot of that complexity
All
has kind of been
reliable.
narrowed down. Yeah, a lot of that complexity has been narrowed down, but there are still niche cases where it's not correct to do that. And knowing when those niche cases are is really important. The other thing that Katsu has is Katsu is every attack Katsu presents is an on hit because of his hero ability. His hero ability says when your next ninja attack action hits, you can then discard a 0 to go 2 or something, right? So knowing how to plan your turn based on whether a card will or will not hit is really important. You have to be able to plan out both paths, and decide what the best hand to keep is based on both of those paths and how much risk you're willing to take.
Okay, budget Katsu.
So Katsu needs Vandal Spring Tunic. Mask of the Pouncing Lynx is actually the big one right now, so no big issues there. But he also plays Command and Conquer, and he plays Art of War.
Right.
So Katsu really likes a lot of the expensive generic cards. Like that's
Okay.
Katsu likes likes those cards.
A very
If you
high
remove
maintenance
those cards,
ninja. Highly
yes, a
visible.
very high maintenance ninja. If you remove those cards, Heart and Crossstrap can replace Vandal Spring Tunic in all but the slowest of matchups, so that one's okay. Command and Conquer, again, you can replace it with things like Erase Face, Humble. That helps a good bit, so you can kind of mitigate those. And Art of War isn't as needed, so he's actually not as affected by the budget constraints as most. I actually think he's pretty similar to Dash in that case. He probably falls down to the Dark Horse level. He does still want those cards, but they're not as important to
They're not
his central
crucial to his
gameplay.
game plan. Okay, great.
Exactly.
So this next one is very interesting. Talk about someone who's run the board. Mr. Top Knot, Kano, our perennial dark horse. What has made this guy break through to join the white horses at the front of the race?
Everybody has to handle Kano, and if they and nobody has all the sideboard slots. That's the problem, right? In this meta is so wide open that everybody has 5 or 6 matchups they really need to prepare for, which means, Kano's one of those, but am I going to, add 5 slots to my sideboard just for Kano? Or can I use those for 2 or 3 other matchups, right? That's the big problem here. So Kano's mostly in the white horse category right now because everybody's choked on sideboard slots, which means they don't have a lot of stuff to deal with Kano.
So Kano he's living the dark horse dream where he's has a specific moment where no one else is doing what he does, so you can't tech against him, even though you get to tech against the top decks. But the meta is so crowded, it can't adjust to close him back out again. So he just gets to run
Yeah,
wild.
that's exactly right. So he is a dark horse that is having an extended dark horse moment, which puts him in white horse category. Like he's just is at that point now. Everybody needs to have a plan into Kano. If you don't have a plan into Kano, you are going to run into one, and it's going to end your tournament run. That's just where it's at. You have to have a plan into him.
Sounds like the man's got style. How does he do into our Pegasi specifically?
So into our Pegasi, he actually has a great matchup into Victor, like almost unlosable. It's real good for him. He has a good matchup into KO, although it's much closer. And then his matchup into Dromai is as close to a coin flip as it gets. Dromai doesn't typically run a lot of Arcane Barrier, but all of her Ash Wings count as Arcane Barrier. They all have Arcane Barrier, which means Kano needs to go off before Dromai either gets multiple Ash Wings or sees Thamai. If Dromai sees either of those two things before Kano pops off, Kano loses. If Kano can pop off before she does those things or in response to those things, Kano has a very good chance of winning that matchup. So
Sounds like
it's almost a coin flip.
quite the shootout. All right, so now we're getting into the higher tiers of complexity. Kano is a 7 out of 10 complexity. If you know
Yes.
a lot about Kano, that's not surprising, but what are kind of the basics of Kano here?
Well, what might be surprising is that he's not higher, right?
Oh,
And the reason that Kano's not higher is because most of Kano's turn by turn gameplay is actually not particularly difficult. Most of his turn by turn gameplay is block with 2 cards, send a spell that helps me dig, like Aether Spindle. Cool. That's it. That's most of his 2 turns. Or, hey, I drew an energy potion. Block with 3 cards, play energy potion. That's his turn to turn play. Most of his regular turns are pretty easy. It's his combo turns that he really has some complexity to it. Now, even in the combo turns, there's a bit of a dichotomy. You have the, oh, I have all the cards for the combo, so I'm going to go, or the, oh shit, I'm about to die, I have to combo now, right? And one of those is much easier to execute than the other. When you have all the combo pieces lined up, the combo is actually relatively simple to execute. It's not terribly difficult, so
but
it's
doing
fine.
it under pressure is a different story.
Exactly. When you are digging for that combo at the end of the game, you know that this next attack kills you and you have to find lethal somehow, then the complexity skyrockets. In that moment, Kano probably sits at like a 9 or a 10 complexity. It's very, very difficult. but all the other moments, he's a lot easier to handle.
Okay. So what about budget Kano? What's he need?
So Kano likes to have Fyendal Spring Tunic, but it's not essential. Um,
Okay.
it is very important to his game plan. It's like the Guardians, but you don't have to have it. You can always run Spellfire Cloak or Threadbare Tunic, and those cost nothing and do basically the same thing on your combo turn. Um, against like so he yeah Fyendal Spring Tunic, not huge but kind of important. The other big one is Storm Striders. Kano has to have Storm Striders. Like this isn't even Dromai where like yeah it's really bad if you don't have Flame Scale Furnace, but at least the deck's playable. The deck's basically not playable without Storm Striders. You just have to have that card.
Okay, great.
But he
So
doesn't
that
have a third one either. So
all right, so Kano is relatively affordable for being a white horse, right? He's like Dash in that regard.
that's correct. Yes. Overall deck cost is pretty low for both of them.
Okay. So now let's go to a personal favorite of mine. I'm very happy to add Azalea here in the White Horses, continuing her winning streak. What's Azalea got that makes her good in this meta?
So Azalea is just the best deck at countering aggro decks, right? Azalea is really good at putting a stop to other aggro decks because Red in the Ledger is such a powerful card. Red in the Ledger is just disgusting. Red in the Ledger literally says you can only take one action if it hits you, which means that card is just terrifying for every aggro deck out there. Azalea has a great matchup, like I said, into the aggro decks, and she does all right into some of the more mid-range matchups. Her biggest difficulty is any decks that are hyper defensive, and any decks that can set up big board presence, which means she has a bad matchup into Dromai, Prism, and the Guardians, Victor and Bravo. Those are her worst matchups, and those are where she really struggles.
But she kills KO, right?
Oh yeah, she has a good matchup into KO. Now I'm not going to say that it's like insane, but she has a good matchup into KO, and that's helped even more by the fact that KO doesn't play defense reactions. So because Azalea relies on Dominate to push through her on hits, and KO doesn't really run defense reactions, he has exactly two in most of his lists. It's very easy to get your on hits through. You're getting most of your on hits against KO. It's a race, and if you hit them with a timely Red in the Ledger, they die.
So it sounds like Azalea has a pretty complicated matchup spread. If you loved Azalea and you were really hoping to bring her to this tournament meta, Zach, what would you be looking at in terms of play rate, win rates to decide whether or not to bring her out?
So you actually want a winner's metagame, right?
Okay.
You really want the metagame to be that metagame we talked about before, where KO beats the other two Pegasi, right? So you want that metagame where KO is the most prevalent. If KO is the most prevalent and the Warriors are coming up to try and beat KO, you have a pretty good matchup into all of that.
A predator to predators. I couldn't love her anymore. What's her complexity?
I've got Azalea as an 8 complexity.
An 8. Even doesn't she have a pretty like consistent game plan of arrows, load them up,
She
fire
does.
them?
She does have a pretty linear game plan, yes, and I still have her in 8 complexity. And
Okay.
the big reason for that is that Azalea has more top deck manipulation than almost any other hero in the game. There's one exception to that. So Azalea is really good at manipulating that top of her deck to try and find the pieces she needs. So knowing when to manipulate, how much to manipulate, when to say this is good enough, when to say, oh, I need to dig for this specific thing. All of that is super, super relevant. And it's compounded by the fact that that means because you can use the top of your deck as an additional card for your hand, thanks to Death Dealer and Azalea's ability, that means that you have multiple sequencing iterations for your turns, and they dramatically influence how effective your turn is. Finding a Red in the Ledger on the fourth card down because you opted one away, opted another away, Death Dealer drew, and then Azalea is a very difficult thing to do, and it can win you the game that you would otherwise have no business winning.
So a lot of players might look at Azalea and think, oh, she has a lot of variance. But you don't think it's really variance because there's so many different ways to manipulate it, right?
That's exactly right. The top tier azaleas, people like Levi Roush, Taylor Crawford, they don't miss Brody Spurlock. They don't miss very often. In fact, they almost never miss. And the reason is because they know how to manipulate that top of their deck and ensure that they're going to have consistent damage output turn across turn. And that's what makes an Azalea a good one or a great Azalea.
Okay, so what about budget Azalea? What does she need to start bringing home marks?
She needs Fiendel Spring Tunic.
So she needs it, not she wants it. She needs it.
She needs it, and she needs it because that card is insanely impactful. So Death Dealer says pay 1 resource, put an arrow from your hand into your arsenal, draw a card. If you have a Spandal Spring Tunic counter, you get a free card off of that. You're just playing a 6-card hand effectively. That's crazy, and almost no other hero has that. You need that effect to keep your numbers above your opponents.
So without Fiendals, does she drop 1 tier more?
She probably drops 2 tiers.
Wow, all the way down to horse.
It's really rough. That's the big one. That's really all that she needs. The other stuff, some lists play Command and Conquer, but that's not necessary or even essential. So it's really just Fiendals, but you need Fiendals. That's super important for this deck.
Our usual suspects keep showing up. All right,
They do.
we're gonna wrap up the white horses with another comeback story, Levia. So what makes Levia good here? After spending quite a long time in the donkey category.
So Levia has the best numbers in the game when she's operating at 100% capacity. When she is at full capacity, she is the best numbers deck in the game, and it's not particularly close. She has 3-card 12s. She has 5-card or 6-card like 37s or 40s. It's scary. She has better numbers than any of the other decks. The difficulty that Levia has is that she has 2 problems. Number one, sometimes she loses to herself. She has variance issues, actually. So she can lose to herself. And then number 2, she isn't quite as fast as she has a hard time blocking out like the ninjas, for example. The ninja decks give her a hard time because they're very quick. Now, she's gotten some help in that category and is much less bad into them than she was before, which is why she's all the way up at this white horse level.
Okay, good for Levia. How does she do into our Pegasi?
So into Victor, Levia is actually a very, very good choice. She has better numbers. She does a better job. She just beats Victor on a lot of the same axes that we were talking about before. Into KO, they're actually very similar decks, right? The difference being that Levia needs a turn or 2 to set up. So because she has to take a turn or 2 to set up, fill her graveyard before she can have her above rate turns, the matchup's really close. She has better numbers once she gets going, but KO can start on turn 0 and go.
Now,
so that matchup is really close. It's pretty much a 50-50.
Now, when it's close, is that a skill-based matchup or is it a variance-based matchup?
Mostly a variance-based matchup,
okay.
truthfully.
So it's who gets their shit first.
Yeah, if Levia is able to set up very early and then sees Blood Rush Bellows and just gets to go, she's going to roll over that KO. On the same token, if the KO sees all his Blood Rush Bellows and Levia doesn't see any of hers, she's probably going to die.
Okay, what about Dragon Lady?
So Levia actually has a slightly better matchup into Dromai than KO. Levia is slightly favored into the Dromai matchup. She's a pretty good deck. Like, she has a higher density of poppers than KO does because KO plays a lot of those blue 5s and things like that. Levia doesn't. She just has all 6s. She has 46s in most of her deck configurations. So she has a huge number of poppers. It's just a matter of getting off enough damage to kill the Dromai, in a reasonable time.
Okay, so Levia is at an 8 complexity, one of the most complex of the white horses and the Pegasi. What about
one
her?
One of the most complex decks in the game, yeah.
Yeah, what about her makes her so tough to play effectively?
It's all about that graveyard with Levia. So Levia really, like, a lot of her cards say banish 3 cards from your graveyard. If you banish to 6, you activate Levia's hero ability, which is to turn off Blood Debt. So a lot of Levia is managing that graveyard and knowing what you really want to do. The best Levia players keep their graveyard at about 3 to 4 cards, and then they fill just enough so that they have it again for the next turn. And they do that consistently so they can output the maximum damage while mitigating their chance of hitting non-6s on their banishes, right? They can guarantee that they're going to hit a 6. Doing that and keeping that close a track of your graveyard and filling it that precisely by blocking, throwing just the right amount, blocking with your armor when the time is right, is really skill intensive. You really need to know all the ins and outs of Levia and what cards you can be drawing into based on what you've not seen. Also, if that's not hard enough, Levia sees so much more of her deck than most other decks because she has Blood Rush Bellows, which draws her 2 cards, Art of War, which draws her 2 cards, and some of her cards draw and discard. So she sees so much of her deck that you really need to be on another level with variance mitigation to really make her sing.
So if you like moving cards around, Levia is a great pick for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about budget Levia? What you got? That bad?
Yikes. So Levia needs, like, Carrion Husk is one of the biggest reasons she has great numbers. Carrion Husk blocks 6. There is no other card armor in the game that does that. Carrion Husk is expensive. So that's a pain point right there. She also plays Fiendel Spring Tunic into the Kano matchup. Now, it's only one matchup, so you don't need it as badly.
You said
Right?
into Kano, so a very
Into
specific matchup.
Kano, a very
Okay.
specific matchup. There's very few other matchups where you really want to do that. Any matchup that's throwing anything that has a 6 power, you just want Husk, but Kano throws only arcane damage, so you need Tunic there. And then she also plays, in the most current iterations, Command and Conquer. So she's got Tunic, Husk, Command and Conquer, and the problem is Tunic's not very needed. Neither is Command and Conquer. Husk is. You really need Husk to be the best Levia deck you can be and have better numbers in the other field.
So there is an entrance fee if you want to play Levia competitively.
Correct. It's that Carrion Husk. After that, you're mostly okay.
Okay, so those are our white horses. We've got Kasai, Bolton, Original Dash, Katsu, Kano, Azalea, and Levia. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we move on to our dark horses?
So all of these white horses can take down a tournament. All of them are good enough to beat the decks above, and this metagame is close enough that the matchup win rates between the Pegasi and the white horses is a very small margin, right? We're talking 5% or so. So if there's ever a meta to pick a deck that you're comfortable with and play it, this is it. If it's on one of these 2 tiers here, you've got a good deck. You can go with it.
Well, the world does belong to the specialists, so I'm happy to see that. Starting off our dark horses, these are underrated heroes or heroes who have the potential to perform really well. We have, to start with, I think, by far the hero with the silliest name in Flesh and Blood, Max the Hype Nitro. So with the Pegasi, we've asked their weaknesses, and with the white horses, we've asked how they do into the Pegasi. What is it about now that makes you think this could be Max the Hype's moment?
So I want to preface this by saying I don't think that the Pro Tour is going to be where Max the Hype shines. Now, there might be some moments during the Pro Quest season or the following national season that gives Max some moments. So the big thing with Max is effectively a combo deck. He is all of his best deck builds are built around construct Nitro Mechanoid. And when you are playing that card against decks like Guardians, it is very hard for them to win if you get multiple action points and play that card. You can present 30 damage with Overpower, and they just can't stop it. And then they die. So you have some really, really good matchups, specifically the defensive decks. So Warriors, Guardians, you have a really good time into. Here's the thing that's holding Max back right now and why he needs a specific metagame to go in. The Brute matchup is tough. If they have something that destroys an item and they blow up your Construct Nitro Mechanoid, you have lost the game on the spot. That is it. So what Max needs is a meta that does not have a lot of brutes. Or brutes that are not teched for Mechanologist.
So very polarizing matchups there.
Exactly. He's actually got a pretty good matchup into most of the decks here. There are 2 exceptions, and it's the Brutes and Kano. He has a really hard time into Kano. Because when he constructs the Nitro Mechanoid, he loses all of his AB. So, Arcane Barrier. So, you need to avoid Kano, and you need to have Brutes that aren't teched for mech. If those 2 conditions are met, Max has a great chance of taking down that event.
Okay, so he's at the start of the list. He's not that complex. How would you rate Max Nitro?
Max is about a 3. And the reason Max is about a 3 is because his entire game plan is set up my hyperdrivers with my ability, get to 3 hyperdrivers, find my high octanes, and then play construct nitromechanoid with high octane. That's it. His game plan is super consistent into every single matchup. And then the nuance for Max comes after you've played construct nitromechanoid. It's, in the aggro decks, after you play construct nitro, you just go, here's my whole hand, I'm going to block, attack you for 6, and then you just outvalue them. Against the Guardians, you need to push a lot of damage. That's where you need high octane. Let me send 30 plus damage this turn. But
Okay.
that's it. There's no nuance outside of what's my game plan once I play Nitro Mechanoid.
Honestly, I would be disappointed if a hero with that name had a mastermind plan going on. What
Agreed.
about Budget Nitro? What about him?
So budget max is the only thing that you really want. You want to have the Tekla Foundry Heart. Tekla Foundry Heart super important. You don't need Spring Tunic. You don't need Command and Conquers. You don't need any of the generic headpieces. You can't play those because Construct Nitro Mechanoid requires you to have all mechanologist equipment. So the only card you really want is Tekla Foundry Heart. And honestly, it's mostly as a 3 block. The extra resource is helpful, but not like essential. There are other cards that you can put in that slot that are fine. They're not great. It'll probably drop you down some win point percentages, but I'm not even sure you'd drop a full tier.
Okay, so Max is like with all
Very
dark
budget
horses,
friendly.
he's a gamble, but he's a pretty affordable gamble.
Yes, he's a very budget friendly gamble.
Okay. Next up, we have an old timer, Reinar Reckless Rampage. What about Reinar do you think he could really succeed in this meta, or has the potential to?
So Reinar's got a couple things going for him. The first one is that Reinar is pretty good into the illusionists. All the brutes are. They tend to be solid into the illusionists, and the illusionists, specifically Dromai, is in a good spot right now. Reinar is also good into, and this is where he gets his edge in this metagame. He's also good into the very defensive decks. Reinar is focused around the intimidate mechanic, which means that you banish a card from your opponent's hand when you discard a 6 power attack. What that means is that your opponents can't block with the cards they want to. So for decks like Kasai and Victor and Bolton, where they have specific cards that are much more important than the other cards in their hand, not being able to block with having the cards they want to block with banished and forcing them to block with other cards is really impactful. So Reinhardt really does well against decks that want to block a lot.
Okay, what does he need to worry about though in this meta?
Katsu, because Katsu doesn't block at all against him, and KO, because KO's trying to just outvalue him and also doesn't want to block. The 2 decks that he has the hardest time into are the decks that don't want to block him and just throw their hands at him.
All right, so he loses to more aggressive decks, basically.
That's exactly right.
Well, poor Reinar, the worst KO, unfortunately. At least in most regards. What about budget Reinar, though?
So Reiner is surprisingly able to play as a budget deck. Command and Conquer is a great 6. Not going to argue that, but it's not a brute 6. So you can swap it out for Humble, you can swap it out for Erase Face, and you're going to have slightly less good results, but still okay results. Vandal Spring Tunic is definitely a card that Reinhardt plays, along with Apex Bonebreaker, the new Brute Arms. Those are both really good, and you definitely want to have those, but you can replace the Fiendals with a Heart and Cross Trap, and it won't hurt your matchups too much. The big one actually is the new one, the Apex Bonebreakers, because Apex Bonebreakers gives you 3 extra block, which lets you buy time to find your good hands and play them. So Apex Bonebreaker is the one you're really hurting to not have there. You can still get by without it, but you probably drop down a tier.
All right. So I skipped ahead a little. Reinar is famous for his variants. How would you rate his complexity, though?
So I've got Reinar at a 4 complexity, and it's very similar to KO and Levia in that it's a lot of its variance mitigation. The difference here is that Reinar is actually less variance intensive than the other decks in most cases. Most of his cards that are non-6s are very easy to play out of your hand before you play the card that needs you to discard a 6. And he's not as reliant on discarding a 6 in most of his setups. So Renner tends to have lower variance than the other two brutes because he has more time to set up variance less hands, right? Hands without variance.
Okay. So, after Reinar, we have by far the worst hero to meet in a dark alley, Azuri. Uh, why might this be Azuri's moment?
So Azuri has exactly one thing that she is terrified of, and that is illusionists. If Dromai is not present in the room, and this is one for like the ProQuest season and then potentially the national season. If there's not a lot of Dromai in the room, man, Zuri's got a good thing going, right? She has a great matchup actually into KO, and she has a reasonable matchup into Victor because Victor doesn't get to play that many defense reactions. Across the rest of the top of the meta, she's actually pretty favored, with the exception of Kano. So the only matchup she is looking to avoid are Kano and Dromai. If she can avoid those two matchups, she's actually in a pretty good spot in this metagame, which means a room without those is very set for Azuri to take over. In fact, Azuri won the most recent Battle Hardened.
Hmm. So, hold on though. You said illusionist. How does she do in the Prism?
So the Prism matchup's actually not as bad, and the reason for that is Prism doesn't have nearly as many setup cards. If Prism plays the Aura plan into her, it definitely makes Azuri's life tougher. But Azuri is actually pretty good at disrupting Prism because she has a bunch of on hits, and when Prism goes the Aura plan, she has a bunch of no blocks. So it makes it a lot harder to enact that plan efficiently and effectively on the Prism side. Overall, the matchup's close and probably in Prism's favor, but it's not nearly as bad as Dromai.
It's
Dromai is
doable.
like, yeah, it's very doable. And if that's your only bad matchup in the room because Dromai and Kano aren't there, you're in a great spot. You're going to because you have some matchups that are so favorable, specifically matchups like your KO matchup that are just very, very much in your favor.
Okay, what about Azuri's complexity?
I've got Azuri as a five. And the reason I've got Azuri as a five, Azuri is very reliant on making her on hit effects connect. And knowing how to bluff and when to bluff is a big part of that. She's actually got a lot of similarities with another deck that we'll talk about later, Dorinthia, where both of them rely a lot on attack reactions. And in order to get those attack reactions to connect, you have to do some additional planning and you have to do some bluffing. The better you are at bluffing, the harder it is going to be for your opponent to know, like to make their blocking decisions, and that's going to make their deck actively worse, right? Because when they don't make the correct decision, you punish them very heavily for it. So Azuri's really good at punishing her opponents.
The poker player's favorite hero. What about budget Azuri? What does she need to come to the table?
Budget Azuri is rough. You really want to have like you can play Arcanite Skullcap instead of Crown of Providence, but man, you really want to be able to cycle your arsenal with Crown. So you can do it, but it hurts you a lot. You can also play without Spring Tunic, but again, it hurts you a lot. And you cannot play without Command and Conquer. You need Command and Conquer for Azuri. So when it comes
What
to budget
what makes it so
Azuri,
necessary? Because you said Command and Conquer can often be swapped out for other stuff.
so Command and Conquer can often be swapped out for other stuff because in the matchups you're playing it, you're just trying to disrupt, and those other cards have a similar disruption. In Azuri, you're already playing those other replacement cards,
Okay.
and Command and Conquer is just better than them anyway. So it makes it much worse. Like you're just losing a set of really good disruption like your best disruptive cards, and you don't really get to replace them because you're already playing the replacements. So it's just much worse for you overall.
Okay. Our next dark horse is a bit of a spicy pick. I'm curious what you'll say. Why could this be Vincett's moment? What do they have going for them?
So Vincett's got a couple things. The first thing is that Vincett. So we're going to talk about Vincett's weaknesses really quick. The hardest thing that Vincett has to overcome, there's two. It's variance in deck building, which can be overcome just by proper deck building. It's very difficult, and you're still going to run into some issues because you're a Rune Blade. You do have some variance that's inherent to the class, but it's something that's very overcomable. The second piece is you really have to worry about being fatigued. Most of this meta has a really hard time fatiguing you. In fact, really the only decks that you're worried about fatiguing you are Victor and Kasai. So if Victor and Kasai, if Dromai is very popular, Vinset gets a good boost. That's really where it comes in, right? Vinset into Dromai, it's a tough matchup. It's not a tough matchup. It's a close matchup. But Vinset has a lot of tools that really help her out. The biggest ones being things like Mauvrin Skies. She has a lot of poppers, so she's able to kind of slow the Dromai deck down. And Mauvrin Skies gives her some really good on hits that she can target at the dragons that are impossible to stop. So it makes Dromai's life harder and harder and harder. If there's a Rune Blade that's going to be good in this meta, it's Vincent. Vincent's got the pieces, she's got the tools. She just has to find that room that has mostly things like Dromai or things like Warrior.
But do you think if the meta adjusts, like, would it be easy for Venset to then get shut out again if things
Oh,
adjust? And
absolutely.
all right.
Absolutely. Vincent could very quickly drop down to a horse or a donkey with like if there's a lot of Victor in the room, she's automatically dropped down.
All right.
She needs a very specific window, but she does have a lot of the tools now. She's a lot better than she used to be.
All right. And you think that's one of the advantages of dark horses is people aren't paying attention to them, and so maybe new cards, new strategies, new deck lists are not on top of. So you think Vincent could really take people by surprise?
Oh, absolutely. If you come into a tournament with Vincent, you're going to take people by surprise. The big question then is how much practice do they have into you? And honestly, I'm going to tell
Not
you the
much.
answer is going to be not a lot. Yeah, the
On a
answer is going to be
competitive level,
not a
not
lot.
much.
Yeah, Vincent, she's definitely a lot more fickle than some of the others on this dark horse list, but in the right place, she can shine, and people just won't have anything to counter her.
Okay, what about budget Vincent? What does she need to make a go of it?
So Vincent generally runs Tunic, but you have a pretty solid replacement in Dyadic Carapace. It doesn't give you the resource, but you often don't need the resource that much. So Dyadic is generally okay, and Dyadic still blocks 3. Uh, Other than that, you don't play most of the expensive cards with exactly one exception, and that is Art of War. The problem is Art of War is needed for your big turns. If you want to beat fatigue, Art of War is the way to do it. Or Art of War is one of the best tools to help that. You're not beating fatigue without Art of War.
Now, Vincent's already bad into fatigue decks, correct? So Art of War doesn't help her win her favorable matchups. It helps her stand a chance against her unfavorable, correct?
Art of War is good in most of the Vincent game plans. It's just it shines even more in the fatigue game
Okay.
plan. In general, Art of War is a solid card because Art of War allows you to have double rune gate turns, which is something that very few other cards allow for.
Now, here's an interesting one. We have Prism Redux as our next dark horse. Hasn't Prism been posting some victories lately, though?
Prism has been posting some victories lately. Prism is doing pretty well in this current meta. Absolutely.
So why do you
Uh,
think? I normally ask why is it their time to shine. Here I'm going to ask why do you think she might not be shining as bright as her results might indicate? Why is she not a white horse? I mean, if anyone would be, it's
so that's the thing. She has a bad matchup into Dromai, so that already hurts her. And then her brute matchup, KO and Levia, is also pretty rough. If that's not enough, she also has a rough matchup into Bolton. So there are about 4 decks sitting up at the top of the metagame that are pretty hard for Prism. Now, that doesn't mean that she can't beat those decks. She has a pretty solid game plan into all of those, and she's probably sitting at around 35 to 45% into all of those matchups. So she's not like horrendously disadvantaged, but it's enough that over a day of a tournament facing multiples of those, it's going to be harder and harder for you to make your tournament run through. I think that Prism has a lot of potential, and I think that if someone can find some tech pieces to help her beat the brutes, she's going to be in an incredible spot.
okay.
But at the given moment, I'd put her at a dark horse.
So before we go on, what prism are we talking about? Because I know there's been a lot of experimentation in terms of deck lists and weapons and so on. Who are you considering here for this spot?
So I'm talking specifically about the mono Luminaris Angel's Glow prism. That's the one that I have the most experience with. Now, that being said, I know a decent amount about the Iris lists as well, and I've played them at least a decent amount. And the Iris lists are fine too. Um, Honestly, in either case, you're fine. It's the newest Prism, right? It's the newest iteration of Prism. Just so we're clear about this, we're talking about Prism Awakener of Soul, but in either the Luminaris Angel's Glow builds or the hybrid, which have Luminaris Angel's Glow and Iris of Reality, in either case, those decks are pretty solid. They have one big, or like a couple big difficulties, and that's Dromai, the Brutes, and Bolton. Those, they all share the weakness, and that's where they really struggle.
So it sounds like Prism doesn't just have one deck that she has to fear. She has like a number of decks she does poorly in. What kind
That's
of
correct.
meta developments do you think would make things better for her? Because it seems unlikely that all four of those specific decks would drop out at a similar time. Is it?
So I do agree with you there. The thing is that of those, the one that's by far the worst is Dromai. If Dromai goes away, Prism has a solid shot. She can still, like, she's probably 40 to 45% into the Brutes and into Bolton. So she has reasonable play in those matchups. She's by no means dead in the water. She can absolutely win those matchups. The one that she has the hardest time into is Dromai, and it's the most prevalent at the moment. So
Okay.
if you can remove the Dromai, I think Prism has a much better chance.
Okay. Budget Prism. What does she need to shine?
So Prism does not play any of the headpieces, does not play Fandel Spring Tunic, does not play Command and Conquer, does not play Art of War, does not play Enlightened Strike. Prism is, in most cases, a very good budget deck with one exception. She likes Light of Soul. Light of Soul is very important to that deck. Now, is Light of Soul essential? No, but it's about as close to essential as a Fabled can be. Your deck is going to get noticeably worse without Light of Soul
And how
because
expensive is Light of Soul compared to something like Fandles or Command and Conquer?
Light of Soul sits at about 140 right now
Mm.
for
So it's
the
even worse in a lot
for
of
the cheaper
ways.
variant. Yep. But in fairness, that is the only card that is super expensive in the Prism lists. So and you can replace it, right? Your deck is going to be worse. Honestly, it's probably not even enough to bring you down a tier.
Okay.
So you can probably still play the deck without Light of Soul.
Okay. This our final dark horse. Oh, sorry. I should ask about complexity. You have Prism rated very, very highly.
I do. I have Prism at a 9. I have her rated as the second most complex deck in the game. And the reason for that is Prism is a toolbox deck. She's one of the only toolbox decks in all of Flesh and Blood. A toolbox deck is a deck that allows you to have a specific set of one-ofs that you can tutor at different moments to give you an edge in a matchup. Prism's entire toolbox is enabled explicitly by a single card, Halo of Illumination, her headpiece. Halo lets her go and tutor up any figment in her deck, and she runs 6 to 7 of those. And each of them has an interesting effect that can be very, very impactful in the game state. So, because Prism has a toolbox button that she can always press, and she has some incredibly complex lines with her aura package game plan where she's trying to stack multiple auras and has a number of different variations on what she pitches, how she sequences, all of that. She is an incredibly difficult deck to play to maximum potential.
So I've asked about budgets, but here I'll ask about complexity. You have her as a 9 out of 10. And it
Mhm.
sounds like even played perfectly, she still has a tough time in this meta. If you're not an amazing Prism, if you're just like a good or maybe even a great Prism, like what level of mastery does she need to stay in Dark Horse? Like at what point should you just not even bother showing up because she's just too much to handle and even then has challenges at her peak?
So I think it really depends on the room that you're in. So a great example of this, one of the RTNs I went to, there were something like 20 Guardians in the room. Guardian is a good matchup for Prism. Like, it's solidly Prism favored. So in that room, an 80% Prism still gets you within striking distance of the top 8. As it happened, I bubbled out. I got ninth, right, based on some breakers. But I was in a very good position in that room, and I'm definitely not 100% on Prism. But in a room that is filled with Dromize and the Brutes, well, now you need to be even high. Like you need even more Prism mastery. So I think that is also. I think it's actually very context dependent. But the I would say at a minimum you need an 80% level mastery to even begin to consider this hero. And
Okay.
I think you
In a
probably
competitive
want
context.
in a competitive context. And I think you probably want closer to 90% to really like have a good shot.
Now, we're being bearish on a hero that's put in a lot of victories. Do you think though that in the future, like does Prism stand to gain from meta changes? Like if you put a lot of effort into Prism, do you think maybe a couple metas from now, maybe a set from now, it's hard to tell, she could be in a
Oh,
better position?
absolutely. So there's already a very good chance that the next set's going to have illusionist cards in it. The preview that we've been given um, looks a lot like one of the class illusionists. So there's a good chance we're going to get some extra illusionist cards in the next set. And she's already a very solid deck. She's got really good game plans into most of the aggro decks because of Luminaris Angel's Glow. And her game plan into most of the slower decks is also very, very good. And she's got a good win rate into those. Her real difficulty is in decks specifically with a lot of aggression and a high popper count, or decks that do the illusionist game plan of creating permanents better than she does. That's really where she struggles. Bolton's kind of an outlier. Bolton is a difficult matchup for a different reason than most of the others, which is that Bolton has a lot of tools that are very helpful specifically against Prism, right? Cards like Luminaris, or bigger yet, cards like Beacon of Victory. These attack reactions that let him push a bunch of damage that she can't really deal with. She doesn't have any ways to stop. And then all of his stuff coming in on a 4 breakpoint is also really tough because she doesn't play a lot of defense reacts. So that's really why she has trouble with Bolton.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens with Prism. Our last dark horse, I'll say, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire here. Dash.io, who I know is one of your favorite decks.
So I will start off by saying I may
Oh,
have some
wow, okay.
bias here. I may have some bias here. I think I love Dash.io. It's hard for me to not. I probably have some bias here. That's probably fair to
That's
say.
what I'm here for. Don't worry.
That's probably fair to say. But I will say, I actually think that this isn't as bad a meta for Dash as most have been. And the reason I say that is I think the thing, having played a decent amount of Dash.io, I think the thing that is hardest for Dash.io to overcome is disruption. She really struggles. All of her setup cards are cards like Boom Grenade, Teklo Core, uh, you know, backup protocol. All of these cards have a time limit. They have a 2-turn time limit. If you do not use them within those 2 turns, you lose them. Any deck that can disrupt her hard enough to stop her from using them on a turn means that they nullify her setup turns, right? So the big way that mechanologists normally beat those disrupted decks is by setting up things and then having big turns later in the game. Because of the way that Dash.io's setup is built, she has a hard time doing that. If you look at this tier list that we've got right here, there's very little hard disruption. The best hard disruption like heroes in the game are Bravo and Azalea and Azuri. Azuri's in the dark horse category. Azalea's a white horse, admittedly, and then Bravo is currently not on here, right? He'll be in the horse category. So of all the chances that Dash.io has had to actually put in some work, this is one of her best shots. Now, she also has to worry about getting fatigued. That's the other thing she has to worry about. And there are exactly 2 heroes on here that give her a hard time there, and that's Victor and Kasai. But
Two of
both
the most
Victor,
popular heroes in the meta.
admittedly, but Victor and Kasai both have one small problem, and it's actually the reason that Bolton has a pretty good matchup into them. They don't do a lot of pressure. They don't have a huge amount of pressure. They are going to consistently present 10 like 8 to 10, sometimes as much as like 14 or 15, and that's it, which means you can block pretty confidently and take your time setting up in a way that you couldn't before. you're able to say, hey, I have this Teklo core out, and there's very little that Kasai can do to stop me from using this Teklo core on my next turn, which I need to be my big turn. Same with Victor. There's not a lot he can do. He's got Spinal Crush, which is a good Guardian card, and Terra Sunder, which you can cover with armor. And that's about it.
Okay, so that's all well and good, Mr. Sunshine, but here's the thing. You have Dash.io listed as a 10 out of 10 on complexity. You think Dash.io is the most complex deck in Classic Constructed Flesh and Blood right now,
Yes.
correct? Okay,
Yep.
so if she is that complex, how much does that factor into her performance, right? Like, is she a dark
A
horse
lot.
for 3 people and a donkey for everyone else? Because I've seen you put so much time and effort into her, and it seems like you're still just confounded by this deck. How much is that not just something to be mastered, but something that holds her back?
Oh, no, fully agree there. I would not argue that her complexity is the most impactful barrier to entry for Dash.io and the biggest hampering to her win rate. Fully agreed with you there. I think that she is by far the most difficult deck in the game to play. And the reason for that is that every single one of her turn cycles, every single one of her games plays out very differently. Knowing when to play an item off the top, knowing when not to play an item off the top, knowing how likely you are to see items on the top, how much you need to dig to find those items, managing your deck size, and doing all of that while also having to balance your block values when you have so many no blocks in your deck makes her incredibly difficult to play. Just absolutely one of the hardest decks in the game, if not the hardest deck. I would argue the hardest deck. And I do think that that's holding her back. I do think that that's a big part of the reason why Dash.io's win rate is not as high as I think it could be. Uh, the truth is, there's not a lot to do about that except learn to play her better, and that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of investment. So
You would
the
know.
biggest reason, yeah, I mean, the biggest reason that I think I don't think most people are willing to invest the time into Dash.io, and honestly, with pretty reasonable, with a pretty decent reason, she's okay in the meta at best, right? So why would you invest that much time into her for someone that's okay into the meta? And most people are going to just say they won't, and that's fair. That's completely reasonable, and that I think is, like I said, the thing that's holding her back the most. I think if we had someone that was playing her at 100% efficiency, like actually playing her just completely optimally, this deck would be a terror. But I don't know how much investment it would take to get to that point. This deck is that hard.
All right, well, so I want a straight answer here. Would you, like every dark horse here, you've made a case for why they could be good and why they might be worth bringing. Would you recommend Dash.io to anyone who was not a Dash.io lover who was already going to play them anyway? Did you have any case to sell anyone on Dash.io?
I mean, yes, but I think it's a very niche case, so it's probably
Okay.
not particularly worth mentioning. You would need to be one of the best, like one of the highest skill players, period, and really just want a challenge. Like that's what you need. To
I,
be bluntly honest.
sounds very similar to the case you might make for a donkey, but whatever.
With one difference. With one difference. Donkeys don't have the capacity to win in a lot of cases, and I don't think that's the case with Dash.io. I do think that with the proper mastery of the deck, you can win almost any matchup, if not any matchup. Her numbers when she's going off are so beyond what everybody else is doing. It's kind of crazy. You can present 45, 50 damage turns. I've done that multiple times with the deck. There's no other deck that can do that. And for that reason alone, she has a ceiling that that the donkeys just don't have, which makes her at least better than that.
All right. Well, for the record, I'm skeptical, but you've definitely made your case. What about budget Dash.io? Is this another constraint that might hold her back?
Not nearly as much. Dash.io really wants Teklo Foundry Heart, but no, she really wants Teklo Foundry Heart and Crown of Providence. So yeah, this might be another constraint that holds her back because both of those cards are a chunk. The rest of her deck's pretty cheap. She doesn't really need anything expensive outside of those two cards, but she really needs both of those cards.
So,
Crown is so good because you can see the top card of your deck, so you know what you're drawing, and Teklo Foundry Heart just does everything you want it to all the time. It's
so
phenomenal.
is she competitively unplayable without those two cards.
Yeah,
Like
pretty
even
much.
sub donkey, it sounds like.
She's
W-
donkey. She's not.
Okay.
I wouldn't say sub donkey. She's still, even without those cards, she probably beats some of the decks on our donkey tier list, but not by a lot.
Okay.
She'd be in that same category.
Well, that's Dash.io, everyone. Zach, looking back at Max Nitro, Reinar, Azuri, Vincent, Prism, Dash.io, is there anything else you'd like to add for our dark horses?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think all of these decks are very meta dependent. I think that you need to know these are not for the. I would not bring any of these to the Pro Tour, save potentially Prism if you think that it's going to be full of victors. I wouldn't bring most of these to the Pro Tour, and that's because I don't know if the metagame is going to shake out to be positive for them at the Pro Tour. However, for your local ProQuest season, these are decks to consider, especially if you know the meta, what the meta is going to be like going in. If you know you're walking into a 20 Guardian room out of 35 players, Prism is a fantastic choice, right? So just understanding your local meta will help you decide when you should bring one of these decks.
Okay, great. It's a very important note. So now we move on to the horses, and we, in our explainer, we don't mind the horses. We don't think these are terrible. We don't think these are the bottom of the barrel. So, Zach, let's make a case for certainly the most sculpted of Flesh and Blood's heroes, Bravo. Why do you
So
think Bravo might be a good thing to bring to a tournament?
So, in all truth, Bravo's got really solid numbers. He's a guardian, so that already gives him a baseline of consistency that most classes don't have. He's got great armor. He's got fantastic abs. Oh, sorry. He's got great armor. He's
Trying way
got
too hard.
yeah, he's got great armor. He's got a lot of good disruptive on hits. He's one of the most disruptive heroes in the game. He has a really good matchup into some of the top decks. Specifically, he's got a great matchup into Victor. He actually beats up on Victor pretty badly, and he's better into Dromai than Victor is.
Really
In
shows
a
Victor
lot,
who's boss, huh?
yeah, in a lot of ways, Bravo is a very solid deck. I think there's a good argument for him being a white horse as well. He kind of is in between those two categories. The big thing with Bravo that I think is difficulty, or like that I think kind of holds Bravo back a little bit, is that he doesn't have enough play lines in a lot of instances. Most of the time, you draw your hand and your decision is pretty much set. Hey, I drew 3 blues and a crippling crush, and they don't have a lot of armor. I'm dominating this crippling crush unless I don't have the life total to do so. That's it, right? You don't have a lot of flexibility outside of all right, block for 6, throw hammer, which means that you have a hard time capitalizing sometimes on what your opponent on your opponent's floundering, right? You can throw a dominated crippling crush, make them have a terrible turn, and then draw a hand of 4 blues that does nothing, and now you can't capitalize on that at all, and that's brutal, and that's kind of the biggest difficulty that I think Bravo has.
Yeah. So complexity is the big feature of horses we want to talk about. You have Bravo rated very low. You have him rated at 2 out of 10. So arguably one of the second or third simplest hero in the game. So,
Yes.
and you think that can be a good thing because it makes the deck very consistent, but is unreliable.
It's not so much that it's unreliable; it's that it can't capitalize as well on mistakes or
Okay.
on bad situations for your opponent. Right? There are times as a Bravo player where like you can chain disruption over and over and over and high roll your opponent and beat them. There are also plenty of times where you put a huge disruptive attack on them, you destroy their turn, they don't do a lot, and then you draw into something that just isn't very effective. It doesn't do a lot of damage. It's not disruptive, and you just kind of have this super middle of the pack turn, or even worse than that, you just throw a hammer for 6 and go, cool, that's my turn after I disrupted you and took all the tempo. Now you have tempo back. Go ahead. And that's really, really damaging for his ability to be good. The best Bravo players mitigate that, right? They arsenal high priority disruptive targets. They make sure that they can chain their disruption when they have it. They have all of that. But the way Bravo's built, you're still going to just run into those hands that don't do a lot. The biggest thing for Bravo, the two reasons that I've got him here in the horse category is Bravo's he's not a very he's a very linear deck in most cases, right? Your game plan into Illusionist is you need to clear their stuff. So you're going to play all your go again cards. You're going to be pretty aggressive, and you're going to beat the snot out of them. And that's the case for most illusionists. Save for like a fatigue illusionist back in like Big Dragon Dromai, but then you just switch to your fatigue plan, and that's it. Against like Azalea, you're playing a fatigue game plan. That's it. You've got a very solid one box game plan that does really well. Against the aggro decks, you're playing a mid range game plan, waiting till they have an offhand, hitting them with a huge disruptive effect, and then you're just carrying that to the win, right? So he doesn't have a lot of flexibility in his play lines, which is really, I think, the biggest reason Bravo's here in this category.
Okay.
Very similar to our next
Yeah.
hero.
We might talk about them a little bit together. Next, we have a personal nemesis of mine, Phi, who has had a little bit of a fall from grace in some ways. What makes Phi a horse instead of maybe a dark horse?
Phi is just doing less numbers than the best decks at the moment, and that's really the biggest defining factor here. Phi is an all-in aggro deck, so he doesn't have a lot of flexibility on his cards either. His cards don't like to block. It's different than Bravo. Bravo can block pretty easily. He sometimes struggles to have a really good offense. Phi has the opposite problem. He has great offense. He has very poor defense, and he's very bad at blocking. So he often doesn't want to. His hands mostly say attack with all of this or most of this, right? Which means that he loses a lot of optionality with his hands. And when his numbers are the same as KO's or Victor's or Kasai's, but he has less optionality with his hands than KO, Victor, and Kasai, it means that he just doesn't have the flexibility to play the same game that they can. He doesn't get to go, oh, all right, this is a bad hand, block 9, throw a 2-card 9, pass. He has to go, oh, this is a bad hand, but I can't really block with it anyway. I guess I'm throwing half of it. Or, okay, I'm going to block with 2 cards and then throw 6 damage, which is just not very effective.
So even though, I mean, Phi was a meta king or arguably a meta terror at one point, but now he does not have the potential to even make it into Dark Horse. Like he just does what he does and no more, correct?
That's pretty much it. Yeah, there's not a huge chance to surprise anybody with Phi at this point. Everybody knows what Phi's game plan is. They know when you have an Art of War turn, you're going to present good above average, above rate numbers. That's a good turn for you, and they know how to handle that, right? Phi doesn't have. There's no. He can't surprise anyone. Much like Bravo, he can't really surprise anyone. And if they are a flesh and blood player that's been playing for more than like 6 months, they're going to know what your deck does and have a solid game plan into it that's going to work at least decently well because your deck is just that linear.
So his previous success has taken away a lot of the surprise factor some dark horses can get away with.
That and he's just lost some power.
Yeah.
He had Stubby Hammer's band and he had Belittle band. Like those were two of his most powerful things that he could do, and he lost them. So he's just actively lost some of his power cards, while everybody around him has gotten additional power cards,
Not
which brings him much more in line.
Yeah, not the ninja he used to be. But I have, before we move on to our last horse, I have a question here. You said that horses can be good to bring into tournaments because they free up mental resources for other things. You can read your opponent, for instance, and look very carefully at how they're viewing their cards. But my question is, even if you get really good at that and you have all the mental bandwidth to, deduce what your opponent had for breakfast, if if these decks are so limited, what is the point if they can't even capitalize on whatever you might read from your opponent? Like Phi and Bravo, will they even help you if you're using this mental resource for other stuff?
So they can help you capitalize a little bit. Bravo probably more than Phi. So Bravo can say, "Hey, I've seen this card in the arsenal for a few turns. When they saw it, they looked pretty excited. I'm betting that's a sink below. So that means I don't really need to throw any dominated attacks. I really need to prioritize just like putting out good offensive capability."
So that brings us to a hero I will have a very difficult time being objective about. So I'm happy you're here. Let's talk about by far the most glorious, impressive, amazing, best in general hero in Flesh and Blood, Dorinthia Ironsong. Why is this champion of goodness and beauty all the way down in horse? I mean, Zach, explain yourself.
So the biggest issue with Dorinthia is more than anything, her numbers are just subpar without a counter. So she really struggles to get ahead. Once she gets ahead, she is a menace. She is a very difficult deck to beat. It's very hard to stop her. When she starts snowballing, she's really, really good. The problem is that starting that snowball is pretty difficult, and there are some heroes that just have off buttons after you've started to snowball. Great examples of that being decks like Bravo or Azalea or Azuri or Prism, who can just kind of say, "Oh, you've started to snowball, cool. Dominated red in the ledger. Now I just give you my whole hand. Your snowball's over." And there's not much you can do about it. So she has some inherent weaknesses that bring her kind of into this tier, unfortunately.
So I object to the implication Dorinthia has any weaknesses, but I also want to ask, to what extent is she down here based on just the meta? If the meta shifts, could she rise? I mean, you named some heroes that counter her that are not very prevalent. Only Azalea is a white horse of the ones that just off switch her.
Well, just because they can't just off switch her doesn't mean the other decks aren't good into her, and that's the problem, right? Victor still has a pretty good matchup into Dory just because he has so many four blocks. Uh, Bolton and Kasai both have pretty good matchups into Dory because they have just as many, like just as high block values or higher block values than Dorinthia, and can cover up her stuff pretty well too. The problem with Dorinthia is mostly just that she has underrate cards. A lot of her cards just aren't at the rate they need to be to give her the kind of edge she needs to be above. I would love to tell you that Dory can get better with a metagame shift, but every single time the metagame shifted and we've been like, yeah, Dory has a shot, she just falls back down to this same kind of range. And I think it's just that she needs a little bit more love. Just a little. I don't think she needs a lot, but 1 point of value, like when you have a counter, your Dawnblade feels like one of the most terrifying things for any aggro deck to face. But when you don't have a counter, most aggro decks kind of just go, okay, yeah, you blocked with 2 cards. I took 6, you throw 3, I block for 3, you don't get a counter, I get to keep doing my thing. And it makes it very hard for her.
Well, it sounds like this dark horse has lost her darkness, and that is definitely the greatest tragedy in the history of Flesh and Blood, and arguably, human history. Um, you have, however, for complexity, you've rated her 5 out of 10, significantly higher than Bravo and Fi's 2. What about Dory makes her so much trickier to play, or at least so much
Uh,
more involved?
Yeah, so going back to what I was talking about with Zuri, she's very attack reaction focused, which means that a lot of her complexity comes from how you use your attack reactions and when you use them, right? So knowing which attack reactions to use, how to use them, and you also have Singing Steelblade, which lets you tutor any specific attack reaction. So you even have a little bit of a toolbox. You really have to know the ins and outs of the Dory deck and which attack reactions are most effective in which situations in order to optimize her play, right? You have to be good at bluffing and you want to be good at reading people. So Dory, being in the horse category is not actually a terrible thing for Dory. We were talking about this kind of freeing up some mental space to focus on other things. One of the biggest advantages you can have as a Dory is when you know how to read your opponent, so you can know when to expect a D-react and when not to, which means that in a lot of ways, that's actually an advantage for Dory. If the player, the pilot, has a little bit of extra bandwidth to kind of try and focus on reading their opponent, they can get some really significant percentage points out of that.
So that's my next question. So Dory is significantly more complicated than Phi and Bravo, but she's still in the same tier as them.
Mhm.
So does that complexity create like results? Does it allow for more outplay potential, or is it just a lot more work to get to the same thing Bravo can do by throwing a big hit?
It does allow for some additional outplay potential, but at the end of the day, her game plans are still pretty locked. And that's kind of where the difficulty lies, right? The aggro decks know that Dory is almost always just going to block with 2 cards, throw her sword with go again, and try and get 2 swings in, right? And she's just going to try and play that game because that's the most effective game plan she has against them. It's very rare that Dory's going to keep a 4 card or 5 card hand against an aggro deck because she's just not often going to get all the value off of it, right? So the difficulty with Dory is that your opponents can kind of force you into play patterns that are beneficial for them, even if they're the play patterns you want to pursue, right? If you're throwing, blocking with 2 cards, throwing 2 cards against Phi, they can kind of put you into that play pattern and set it up in such a way that you don't ever have you don't have the extra card to have a reaction. So now they can just very calmly block for 3 on your second swing and never block anything else, and they're just going to output more damage.
All right.
And that's the trouble.
Well, I will swallow my disappointment until I can cry later. The last thing I want to ask, so we've pitched these horses as good kind of newcomer decks if you're new to the tournament scene. What about budgets though? Like, is it affordable to bring Bravo, Phi, or Dorinthia to a tournament if you're just trying to test things out?
So actually, in terms of budget, Phi is one of the best budget options. There are a lot of reasonable Phi builds, or at least like competitively viable Phi builds that require very little. Typical Phi plays Massive Pouncing Links, which is pretty cheap, your Flame Scale Furnace, which is expensive, and Tunic as your 2 chess pieces. But you don't have to play those. You can play Best of the First Fist. You can play Spring Blossom. I've seen people play Spring Blossom, and it's still pretty effective. So Phi is relatively easy on the budget. The biggest card, like the most important card that is expensive, is Art of War. But even Art of War is something you don't have to have. It's a good thing to have. It helps your deck a lot, but you don't have to have it. So I think in terms of budget entry, Phi is probably one of your best options, period.
Okay. What about Bravo and Dory though?
So Bravo really wants to have Spring Tunic to have above rate turns. You can play Tectonic Plating instead, but you're going to lose some significant percentage points there. And then he really, 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 really wants to have Command and Conquer, because Command and Conquer Pummel is one of the best things Bravo can be doing. And that's always going to be a huge hit
Yeah.
to the cost of the deck.
What about
As
Dory?
for Dory, Grains of Blood Spill is expensive, Crown of Providence is expensive, and Balance of Justice is expensive. So all 3 armor pieces. You can replace Grains with Courage, and you lose some percentage points, but not too many. It's okay. You can replace the head pieces with Arcanite, and you lose some percentage points, but not too many, so it's okay. She does also play Command and Conquer, but you don't have to play that either. So all in all, you can play her at a budget pretty reasonably and still do most of the things Dory is trying to do. You will lose some percentage points, but it's definitely not enough to put you into donkey tier.
Okay, great. Well, so now we have our donkeys. We can
Well,
go quick.
really quickly.
Yeah,
I do
sorry.
want to
Is there
just
anything else you'd like to add?
yeah, I want to just overall say being a horse doesn't mean that these are workhorses, right? These decks are workhorses. They do one thing, they do it consistently, they're good at doing that thing, right? There may be better choices in the meta. I think that Victor's a better choice than Bravo in most cases right now. I think that Katsu's a better choice than Phi. I think that Kasai is a better choice than Dory, right? And that's kind of why they're here in this tier. But that doesn't mean these decks are bad by any means. These decks are still solid. They can still put up results, and they can still even take down tournaments. But you really need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the deck and know how to kind of mitigate some of those weaknesses in order to really get the maximum points out of them. And that's where having, being able to read your opponent, skills that are not just playing the game come into play.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of wisdom if you're new to tournaments, walking your first tournament and not having the attitude of, oh yeah, I'm going to walk away with this whole thing, number one, but instead being like, I'm going to approach this tournament as a learning experience, and I will get better. I will learn all the ins and outs of it. And then at my next tournament and the one after that, I will post better results. I don't think that is an uncompetitive mindset at all. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
I completely agree. And these kind of decks let you focus on things like pitch stacking. They let you focus on things, just reading your opponent. They let you focus on things that are difficult to focus on in most games because they're a little bit easier to pilot.
Yeah. All right, well, so now our donkeys, most of these decks will not surprise you. These are decks that are known to be poor. So I would like to talk a little about most of these decks will only be played by people who love them. I'd like to hear your opinion on what these decks do well, or at least what they're fun with, even if they don't do well, and if you think what they might need to be better and to maybe hit the horse or even dark horse tier someday. Um, so first of all, we'll have Arachne. What's Arachne got?
So Arachne has some really decent disruption. He actually has very solid disruption, similar to Azuri. A lot of the assassin cards are pretty disruptive. So Arachne's a good disruptive deck. The problem is that his overall rates aren't very good. He has a really hard time into Dromai. There's a number of things that are rough for him, right? But his disruption's pretty good. He's got a very solid disruption base, and then his overall like his armor suite is actually pretty robust in a lot of cases because of the ability to buy it back with silver, which gives him some extra value in terms of blocking that a lot of other decks don't have. So he's got some good points to him for sure. He just doesn't have the rate to back it up.
So longer term, what do you think you would be on the lookout for to see, huh, maybe Arachne could be a dark horse now. Like maybe he could have a moment coming up.
Yeah, so you need either one of two things. The first thing is a meta where mid range is king, right? Where it's just the best to be the best mid range deck you can be, because he can play a pretty good mid range deck with his attack reactions and things like that. Or or you need more go agains printed for this deck, right? They just printed one Arachne specialization that gives him the ability to kind of go wide. He needs more of that. So one of those two, one of them is very meta dependent, the other is very Arachne dependent. I would prefer the Arachne part, right? More go against would be a big deal for Arachne.
Okay, next up we have a new hero, Betsy. So what didn't work out for Betsy? Why is she all the way down here? And what are you looking out for that you think might give her a boost?
Truth is that Betsy is just the worst of the Guardians. There's no getting around it, right? Why would you play Betsy when you could play Victor or Bravo? And the answer is, if you're trying to win, there isn't a good reason. Um, Betsy's main mechanic focus is wager, and there are not a lot of good wager Guardian cards. So Betsy needs more wager Guardian cards, or the other two Guardians to rotate out. That's really it. If the other two Guardians rotate out, like Betsy is still a reasonable deck because she's just a guardian. Her floor is still really solid, right? So there's no like she's not a terrible deck. She's probably one of the best decks in this donkey tier. Uh, but there's no reason to play her over the other guardians, which puts her down here.
But if another set comes out and there's more wager cards, would you be thinking, huh, maybe time to take a second look at Betsy?
Absolutely would. I would definitely take another look at Betsy because any good wager cards for Guardian really give her a chance to shine.
Okay, great. Now we have another heavy hitters hero, Olympia. What's his story?
Honestly, very similar story to the above, right? There's just no good reason to play Olympia when you've got Kasai, Bolton, and Dory all up above him. And that's really the difficulty that Olympia has. Now, Olympia, so first thing, it's very similar to Betsy in that he really relies on wagers. So you want more wager warrior cards to really make him shine. But the other thing that Olympia has going for him is his specialization is a blue card, and it's a good blue card. Warrior blues are notoriously not very good. Olympia is kind of the exception to that at the moment because he's got three extra good ones, but it's still not enough. So either Olympia needs good wager cards to help him, or he needs good reasons to be a blue heavy warrior because he'll be the best blue heavy warrior.
Okay, good. Uh, what about Riptide?
Whew. So
That bad,
Rip,
huh?
Riptide just has a fundamental difficulty. His entire like character design is based around like his the first part of his ability where you get to load in cards to your arsenal is really powerful. But he's just weaker than the other ranger Azalea by a substantial margin. His second ability is really where he gets like his special, like his uniqueness, and that's all focused around traps. And traps are weird because if your game plan is to play with traps, you have a hard time balancing that with being a very aggressive ranger, which is what Riptide wants to be with that first ability. His first ability wants him to play a pump load an arrow, fire the arrow, and play a very low cost, low resource intensive game that is all about pumping and firing arrows. And then his second ability wants him to have these defensive cards in his deck that don't synergize with that first plan at all. And that's where the difficulty comes in. You have these two opposing pieces that don't really connect. And that's kind of the trouble for Riptide.
So if he has a contradictory design, what do you think might bridge that gap a little? Do you think like a specialization card could do it, or an armor piece? What would you be looking for?
I would probably be looking for a specialization card because he's already gotten one that kind of helped bridge that gap a little bit. He got a 0 for 4 blue arrow that gives your opponents 2 beneficial tokens, but those tokens allow you to turn on all your traps. So it lets your traps kind of play offense and defense. I like that. I think that that's a very good direction to take him, but they need more crossover. He's only got one card that crosses over at the moment, and it's just nowhere near enough.
Okay, next we have Viserai, our other rune blade. What's what's going on with Viserai?
The truth is that Viserai just doesn't have the output that he needs, right? The deck had always had a bit of inconsistency because you're playing half non-attack, half attack to try and maximize Sonata Organics and all these other cards. And so you kind of had this dichotomy where sometimes you just draw a hand that doesn't do anything because it's all non-attacks, right? So that's not great. But then on top of that, like the reason to kind of muddle through that variance was because his numbers were really good. Well, after the loss of Rosetta Thorn, his numbers aren't nearly as good anymore. And couple that with the fact that a lot of his numbers are based on hits that a lot of heroes can block out now because armor's gotten so much better. He just doesn't have any legs to stand on. He just doesn't have the output that he needs to be competitive at the moment.
So would you say so? We have both the Runeblade heroes in the format right now are performing pretty poorly. Do you think then there is reason to hope for some pretty strong Runeblade cards, since now there isn't a Briar here who could take them and run all the way to Pegasi?
I think there is some potential for some strong Runeblade cards to come out. Yes, I absolutely do think that's a chance. Like the previous Runeblade cards are fairly strong, but they are nowhere near enough to make these decks stand on their own, right? Having just Revel in Runeblood and Swarming Gloomveil is not enough to get Viserai to like a good tier at this point. Same with Vincent. And that's kind of like, I mean, shoot, Vincent doesn't even play either of those cards. And that's kind of the issue. They just like, they have a couple cards that are above rate, and then everything else is like, fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, the last one, I'll leave it to you. I know you tried so hard and worked so hard to try and explore Teklavasan, and you do have him ranked as significantly more complicated. These others are 3 and 4s out of 10. You have him at a 6. So what are your thoughts on Teklavasan?
So I actually think that Tekla-Vassen's got a lot of interesting play patterns. The problem is that I don't think they ever end up actually mattering because you're just worse than every other deck, and that's about it. Like he just doesn't. His best cards, the blue Evos, cost 4, not 3. So they're a 2 card investment minimum, and that's if you banish them. If you haven't banished them, they're a 3 card investment. That's brutal, and they're only worth 6 value. That's horrendous, right? Singularity, his specialization, his legendary specialization, is the most powerful win con in the game if you have all the blue Evos equipped. But getting to that end state requires so much setup, so much time, so much investment. And most of the time, you just kind of die before you get to that state. And if you don't die before you get to that state, then you have a chance at the matchup. He's actually really good into the Guardians and into the Warriors. He actually has a great matchup into both of those heroes. But he has a almost, I think it's an actual 0% matchup into Dromai and a 10% matchup into Kano.
That bad? I have not heard you use those
Yeah,
those kind of matchups in any for any other hero.
yeah. He just has decks that he literally cannot beat no matter what he does. And that leaves him down here. Like he needs a way to beat those matchups, or he's just not. Honestly, the fact that he had a 10% win rate into Kano blew my mind because I don't know how that happened. Honestly, he has no AB. What is he supposed to do? Like he just doesn't have the tools he needs to be competitive at a high level event unless you get all of the matchups to go exactly the way you want.
Okay, well, so it sounds like Teklevasan, kind of like Kano, he has kind of his own game plan that's pretty interesting. It doesn't seem like some strong generic mechanologist cards would really help him out. What do
No.
you think would let the esteemed magnate really put in an appearance?
So he needs a couple different things. Either like Dromai would probably need to LL to be truthful. Like you can give him some cards to help him with the Dromai matchup. I don't think they're going to make that matchup ever better than like a 30%. So honestly, he probably just needs Dromai to LL. Uh, Outside of Dromai LLing, he needs better access to Arcane Barrier because the current Arcane Barrier he can play is counter to the Singularity game plan, which is his best game plan. Period. So you need Arcane Barrier that is not counter to your Singularity game plan. And if you don't have the Arcane Barrier start on the board, so if you have to Evo it in, then you just give Kano as many windows as you can to kill you before you find the Evo that lets you have Arcane Barrier. So you really need just like a way to start out with Arcane Barrier and keep it for the entire game. That's so he needs those two things: Dromai LLing and a way to have actual Arcane Barrier. If he gets to those two things, I think he actually has a reasonable chance.
Okay. Well, it's a good thing to hope for. Everyone, thank you. Icelander has now LL'd, so we have covered every hero in Classic Constructed at the moment. We understand if you just skip straight to your preferred hero, that makes a lot of sense. But if you've been watching this whole time to hear our thoughts, we really appreciate it. And if you have any questions or comments or anything you would like to say more, yeah, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what you think. But I had a great time doing this. I'm sure you did as well, Zach. And
I did.
so uh, whatever hero you choose, may they lead you on to fame and glory in the coming tournament season.
Absolutely. Good luck.